Hey guys. Tonight's we begin with the eerie thrill of peeling back the curtain on America's strangest true conspiracies. The ones that sounded ridiculous until history tapped us on the shoulder and whispered, "Actually, that part really happened." You feel the chill of recognition, the sensation that the past has been politely lying to you, and you cannot decide whether to laugh, gasp, or unplug everything with a power cord. These stories crawl through the archives, slip into confessionals, and sometimes fall out of filing cabinets at exactly the wrong moment. So before you get too cozy, take a second to gently tap that new hype button YouTube just added. It really does help little guys like me push through the algorithm. And be sure to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now, get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. You step into the maze of American conspiracies the same way a tourist wanders into a carnival funhouse, curious, amused, and absolutely convinced you will walk out unchanged. At first glance, the whole place feels familiar. You have heard the stories, the whispered suspicions, the late-night ramblings of people who insist the government once trained pigeons to deliver mail telepathically. You expect exaggeration, maybe a sprinkle of truth, but mostly entertainment. Then the walls shift around you, the floor tilts a little, and the unsettling realization settles in. Some of the strangest theories, the ones you laughed at during childhood sleepovers, did not just contain a grain of truth. They were practically historical documentaries with worse lighting. You take another step and the air changes, thicker now, charged with the energy of secrets that should never have existed in the first place. You begin to understand the real rule here. Nothing is too absurd, too wild, or too ridiculous to be true. The more unbelievable the story, the better the odds that somewhere in a forgotten archive, a faded memo confirms every detail. You think about the people who came before you, the skeptics who rolled their eyes, the believers who scribbled notes in dimly lit basements, and you start to see both groups have been walking the same path all along. You pause at a corner where two corridors meet. The left one whispers with rumors of vanished towns and shadow laboratories hidden behind cornfields. The right one hums with stories of men in expensive suits who met in windowless rooms and made decisions no textbook ever mentioned. You pick a direction at random, telling yourself it does not matter. Every hallway leads to something stranger than the last. A file cabinet sits crooked against the wall as if shoved there in a hurry, drawers half open, papers spilling out. You reach for one, expecting maybe a benign report about crop yields or census data. Instead, you find a document stamped confidential that reads like the opening script of a dystopian thriller. You try to imagine the person who wrote it, sipping coffee at a government desk, casually describing programs that would someday fuel decades of paranoia. It is almost comforting to picture them yawning and checking their watch. But somehow that makes the truth more disturbing. You move on, passing a cluster of doors, each marked with titles that sound both harmless and deeply suspicious. You hear faint echoes of old congressional hearings, polite voices discussing things that should never have needed discussion. In one room, someone mumbles about experiments on unsuspecting citizens. In another, a typewriter clacks steadily as an employee drafts a cheerful press release about something that definitely was not cheerful. Everywhere you look, the nation's past feels like a patchwork quilt stitched by a committee that could not agree on anything except secrecy. Farther in, the labyrinth narrows. The walls lean in, crowding you gently, as if urging you to look closer. You notice how the threads of different conspiracies begin to intersect. A military report overlaps with a pharmaceutical memo written decades later. A classified cable from a foreign embassy lines up eerily with a newspaper story that was once dismissed as fiction. You start to see the pattern, subtle but undeniable. The truth never hides in one place for long. It leaks, drifts, merges with rumor, until the difference between fact and speculation becomes a soft blur. You think of the people who insisted the government was lying long before anyone believed them. The neighbors who sounded eccentric, the journalists who dug too deep, the whistleblowers who risked everything. They were mocked, ignored, or called dramatic. Yet here in this twisting archive, their voices echo like guides who arrived long before you. You feel a strange kinship with them. Not because you share their certainty, but because you now understand how easily truth slips through the cracks. As you turn another corner, the labyrinth begins to open, the hallways widening, the ceiling lifting. You feel the weight of everything you have learned, but also a peculiar exhilaration. The world is stranger than anyone admitted, stranger than the stories you thought were jokes. You realize that conspiracies thrive not because people invent them out of boredom, but because history sometimes behaves like an improv troupe with no supervision. You reach the exit, a soft glow spilling into the corridor, and you pause one last time. You look back at the winding paths, the secrets piled in careless stacks, the quiet truth humming through it all. You step into the light, knowing the rule will follow you long after you leave. In this country, the line between conspiracy theory and historical fact is not a wall. It is a revolving door, and it never stops turning. You learn quickly that government secrecy behaves less like careful record-keeping and more like a garden that no one admits to planting. You wander deeper into it, feeling the soil shift beneath your feet, rich with misplaced files and forgotten memos, and you begin to understand how absurd ideas take root. At first, the theories sprout quietly, whispered among neighbors, or passed across diner counters with the same tone people use when discussing unusual weather patterns. Most of the time, you brush them off, telling yourself the truth is probably boring. Then you find out the truth was not boring at all. It was simply locked in a drawer, filed under something harmless, waiting for sunlight. You picture the officials who cultivated this strange ecosystem, people who believed that if they stamped a document confidential, the universe itself would politely avert its eyes. They worked in buildings with humming fluorescent lights and stale coffee, where every decision seemed to require 3 signatures and occasional amnesia. You imagine them meeting in small rooms with thick curtains, saying things like, "This stays between us," while accidentally setting the groundwork for decades of suspicion. The secrecy never starts with drama. It begins with a shrug, a convenient omission, a quiet moment when someone decides the public would sleep better not knowing certain details. You walk through the invisible greenhouse they built, feeling the warmth of stories that grew wild in the dark. Strange rumors branch across decades, their vines twisting through elections, military bases, and dusty libraries. You overhear a tale about a strange experiment in the 40s, dismissed as nonsense until a memo surfaces 50 years later, confirming every unbelievable detail. Another rumor blossoms near a stack of court documents, each page revealing a new layer of what officials once pretended did not happen. You start to realize that secrecy has a talent for turning mundane events into mysteries simply by omission. The deeper you go, the stranger it gets. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the rustle of rumors about weather manipulation programs, whispered behind closed doors for years. You follow the sound and find an official report so vague it might as well have been written in interpretive dance. Another path leads you to the hushed stories of surveillance systems that predate the modern internet. Ideas people once called outrageous until the declassified schematics emerged like long buried fossils. You pick one up carefully, trying to understand it, and feel the unnerving sensation of your worldview stretching. You notice how secrecy feeds rumor, the way sunlight feeds a forest floor. When the government refuses to explain something, the gap fills itself. People guess, speculate, exaggerate, but sometimes they guess a little too close to the truth. You see this pattern everywhere. A small classified program becomes a whispered conspiracy. A strange incident with no explanation grows into a legend. An experiment no one wanted to acknowledge becomes a cautionary tale repeated around kitchen tables. Over time, the theories stop belonging to any single person. They become part of the culture, a shared mythology built on half-truths and late-night radio. You pause at a shelf of once classified files, noticing how ordinary they look. There is nothing dramatic about the manila folders, nothing ominous about the bland printed labels, yet inside them lie the stories that once sounded impossible. You flip through the pages, reading the clipped language of officials who wrote as though the words would never see daylight. Their tone is calm, methodical, almost reassuring, which somehow makes everything worse. You realize that the ridiculous theories existed because the real explanations were kept behind locked doors, and once revealed they turned the conspiracy theorist from town oddity into accidental historian. As you move deeper into this garden of secrecy, you start to understand that the absurdity of a theory is not a measure of its truth. History has proven that more than once. The strangest part is how normal secrecy felt to the people who maintained it. They were not thinking about future generations dissecting their choices. They were thinking about deadlines, reputations, and the belief that order depended on silence. You see the irony now. The silence did not maintain order. It created the perfect breeding ground for imagination to sprint ahead of reality. Another corridor opens before you, lined with file boxes stacked like towering hedges. Some boxes are still sealed, their contents decades away from daylight. You feel an odd chill thinking about the stories that have yet to surface, the quiet truths waiting for someone persistent or unlucky enough to find them. You know now that every conspiracy theory grows from the same simple seed, a question without an answer, a truth withheld, a decision made by someone who believed secrecy was safer than honesty. As you step forward, you feel the weight of that knowledge settle in your chest. The garden grows because someone keeps watering it, and the strangest theories flourish because the soil was prepared long before you arrived. You make your way into a quieter corner of the labyrinth, expecting maybe some obscure policy dispute or an abandoned research idea involving soil samples. Something harmless, something mundane. Instead, you stumble onto a story so unnerving you have to stop walking for a moment just to process the words on the page. Project Sunshine. It sounds cheerful, almost friendly, the sort of name you would give a children's summer program or a government initiative to encourage vitamin intake. You half expect the documents to smell faintly of citrus, but the deeper you read, the faster the warmth drains from the name until it feels like the most misleading label ever slapped onto an official folder. You learn first about the era that birthed it, a time when the world lived with the constant hum of nuclear anxiety buzzing behind every news broadcast. Officials wanted to understand fallout, the long-term effects, the way radioactive particles drifted across continents like tiny invisible ghosts. They needed data, or at least that is what they said. And somewhere in the midst of that need, a group of scientists made a decision that still feels like something pulled straight from a horror movie that forgot to warn the audience. They needed human tissue. Of course they did. And instead of announcing that publicly, they quietly chose methods that had no place near daylight. You picture the meeting where someone proposed the plan, the kind of dimly lit conference room where curtains hang heavy enough to block out conscience. You imagine the awkward silence following the suggestion that perhaps the best way to measure radiation in the human body was to collect samples from the recently deceased, preferably children, because their bones absorbed certain elements more predictably. You try to imagine the nods, the thoughtful frowns, the people who should have stood up and said absolutely not, but instead only asked how many samples were required. The documents describe cadaver procurement with a tone so casual it makes you shiver. Bodies collected from hospitals, morgues, funeral homes, sometimes without the knowledge or consent of families who trusted their loved ones to rest in peace. You trace the path of these samples as they traveled in quiet boxes, labeled discreetly, wrapped carefully, and shipped to laboratories where technicians recorded measurements with clinical precision. You feel a strange disconnect reading about it, as if the emotional weight of the truth is too heavy for the dry scientific language that carries it. You picture the families, unaware, standing at gravesides, believing everything was whole beneath the earth. You think about the letters they never received, the explanations never offered, the government officials who told themselves it was for the greater good. The phrase echoes through the corridors of the labyrinth like a tired excuse. Greater good, national security, necessary research. You begin to see how easily those words can become permission slips for the unthinkable. You find a report that tries to justify it by describing global fallout levels after nuclear tests. It feels like listening to someone explain why they borrowed your car without asking and also forgot to return the tires. The logic is there if you squint, but the method is nowhere near acceptable by any moral compass that points in a remotely sane direction. You keep reading, and the story only grows stranger. Officials requested bones from different continents to compare exposure levels, creating a kind of secret world atlas of radioactive dust mapped onto human remains. It is the sort of idea you expect to find scrawled in pencil on the back of a conspiracy theorist's notebook, not stamped with a government seal. You think about the people conducting the research, scientists who likely believed they were saving lives by understanding fallout. Maybe some of them lost sleep over it. Maybe others did not. The documents never say. They only show numbers, graphs, and lists that hint at the countless unspoken consequences left behind. It makes you wonder how often history hides stories like this behind reassuring language and cheerful project names. In one quiet moment, standing between two rows of dusty files, you ask yourself the question that has been growing since the first page. Why did anyone think secrecy was the solution? The answer settles over you slowly, a realization heavy enough to press into your ribs, because they knew no one would agree to it, because consent would have stopped everything, because a program built on silence can grow without anyone asking uncomfortable questions. You close the final document and set it back on the shelf gently, as if disturbing it too quickly might stir the past awake. The name Project Sunshine watches you from the folder spine, bright, innocent, and profoundly misleading. You walk away wondering how many other stories in this maze are disguised behind pleasant names, hidden in drawers, waiting for someone like you to pull them into the light where they were never meant to be seen. You step into the quiet halls of MK Ultra, expecting old rumors, exaggerated tales, maybe a handful of documents that confirm nothing more than bureaucratic clumsiness. Instead, you feel the air change, thin and chilled, as though the walls themselves remember everything that happened here and would prefer you turn around politely and walk back the way you came. You keep moving, drawn forward by a mix of curiosity and the unsettling sensation that whatever waits ahead is far stranger than the conspiracy theories whispered about it for decades. MK Ultra does not introduce itself with dramatic flair. It begins with a whisper, a memo, a polite letter about research funding that seems harmless until you read the second page and realize no one involved shared the same definition of harmless. The name alone sounds like a failed comic book villain, something a writer discarded for being too unbelievable. Yet as you study the files, you realize disbelief has never once stopped reality from behaving badly. You pass a room filled with proposals written in the careful penmanship of scientists who should have known better. They speak of influencing the human mind, bending perception, loosening the boundaries of memory. You imagine the researchers sitting at metal desks, under fluorescent lamps, surrounded by coffee cups and ashtrays, as though they were planning nothing more serious than a science fair project. There is no sign in their language that they understood how far they were drifting, or perhaps they understood perfectly and simply decided not to care. You turn a corner and find descriptions of experiments that make you stop walking altogether. Some involved sensory deprivation, others chemicals whose names you cannot pronounce, and a few that read like the setup for a prank someone forgot to stop before it became a felony. You discover that unwitting participants were not a rare exception but an intentional feature. Everyday citizens sat in cafes or bars, sipping drinks they believed were completely ordinary, unaware that someone nearby took notes on their reactions. You picture the agents watching from behind newspapers, a performance so absurd it feels like parody, except there is nothing funny about the truth. The deeper you go, the stranger everything becomes. You learn that the project branched across universities, hospitals, and military facilities, each location adding its own questionable ideas to the growing mound of chaos. Some experiments attempted to erase memories, others to fabricate them. It is the kind of science fiction plotline that usually ends with a stern warning about human hubris. Except here, the only warning came years later, wrapped in redacted documents and awkward apologies delivered at congressional hearings. You run your fingers over a classified file so heavily censored it looks like modern art. Entire paragraphs have vanished under thick black strokes, as though someone tried to smother the truth with a marker. The remaining words float alone on the page, disjointed and eerie. You try to reconstruct the missing pieces in your mind, but the silence between the lines says enough. Whatever happened there was not something anyone wanted repeated. As you move forward, the hallway narrows, the lights dimming with each step. You begin to understand why MK Ultra lingered for so long in the public imagination. It is not the experiments themselves, though they are unsettling enough. It is the casualness of it all, the way secrecy allowed ordinary people to carry out extraordinary violations without ever pausing to question whether they had crossed a line. You sense that the participants considered themselves explorers charting new mental frontiers, and in a way they were, though it was less exploration and more a long tumble down a staircase with a clipboard. You pause beside a door left slightly ajar. Inside you see a scattered collection of notes describing subjects who never gave permission, along with observations written in a tone so clinical it borders on coldness. You realize that normalcy slips not because of the bizarre experiments but because of the quiet confidence behind them, the unshakable belief that understanding the mind justified anything, that the ends were noble, even if the methods strayed into the surreal. By the time you reach the final room, you feel a subtle shift in yourself, an uncomfortable awareness settling into your thoughts. You understand now that MK Ultra was not a single event, but an entire mindset, a willingness to chase knowledge with blinders on, ignoring the humanity of those caught along the way. You stand in the dim light and breathe in the stale hush of long-abandoned ambitions, and you know that once you leave these halls, you will never hear the phrase mind control with the same dismissive laugh again. You step into a quieter wing of the labyrinth, one where the air feels heavy in a way that does not come from dust or age but from memory. The walls themselves seem to dim out of respect, as though they know this story carries a weight that laughter or disbelief cannot soften. You expect complexity, perhaps moral ambiguity, the kind of ethical puzzle historians debate over coffee. But the moment you see the first document, you understand this is not a puzzle. This is a wound, and somehow it remained hidden in plain sight for decades. You read the description of the Tuskegee experiment, tracing each line slowly because every sentence feels like it deserves a pause. It began with promises of free medical care, something comforting, something meant to suggest progress in a country still wrestling with the deep scars of inequality. Men signed up believing they were receiving treatment, believing they were being cared for, believing someone in a clean white coat was looking out for them. You picture their trust, the way they must have sat in clapboard waiting rooms, hands folded, grateful for help that was offered so easily. Then you turn the page. The deeper truth emerges without theatrics, written in plain language that somehow feels colder than any dramatic confession. The men were not being treated at all. They were being watched, observed, catalogued. Their illness allowed to progress intentionally so researchers could study its stages like one might observe the life cycle of a plant. You feel your grip on the folder tighten, knuckles whitening, as you try to understand how anyone justified this. You search for an explanation that makes sense, but the pages offer none. Only lists, charts, quiet documentation of decisions that should never have been made. You move through the files, watching the years stretch out far longer than you expect. What begins in the 1930s does not end after a few seasons of misguided research. It continues through presidencies, wars, cultural shifts, and scientific breakthroughs that should have made the entire project obsolete. Yet the men remained unaware, believing they were receiving help while their illness progressed, while their families suffered alongside them, while researchers took careful notes and congratulated themselves on the valuable data being collected. You stop at one particular memo, written in the tidy script of someone who clearly prided themselves on organization. It explains that treatment could disrupt the study and therefore should be withheld. You read the line twice, then again, trying to imagine how a human being could write such a thing with steady hands. You picture the room in which it was drafted, perhaps with a clock ticking softly, perhaps with colleagues chatting about weekend plans mere steps away. The normalcy of that setting feels almost unbearable to imagine. You turn to the aftermath, expecting an immediate uproar once the truth emerged, but the timeline tells another story. Whispers first, then rumors. A journalist finally stepping forward, following leads ignored by others. Years pass, while families wait for answers that should have been offered without hesitation. You see how the truth moves not like an explosion, but like a slow seep through cracks officials hoped no one would notice. Silence was not an accident. It was maintenance, a careful tending of secrecy that kept outrage at bay long enough for the story to age into something people assumed must be exaggerated. You imagine the moment the details finally hit the public, the shock that rippled through communities who already carried the weight of mistrust. You feel the anger that must have surged through people when they realized the truth had been present the entire time, tucked into offices and archives, quietly documented by professionals who believed the study had scientific merit. The outrage becomes almost tangible in the room around you. It lingers in the air, as though every wall absorbed it when the story finally broke. Standing there, you cannot help but wonder how the truth stayed buried for so long. It was not hidden in some deep underground vault. It sat in government buildings, filed neatly, bearing official seals that disguise the horror beneath formal language. You realize that secrecy does not always rely on locks or deception. Sometimes it relies on the simple assumption that no one will bother to look, that no one will believe the story even if they do. You close the folder gently, the weight of it still pressing against your palms. This part of the labyrinth is quieter than the rest, not because it holds fewer secrets, but because it demands a different kind of stillness. You walk away carrying the truth with you, feeling it settle heavily in your chest. Some conspiracies become legend because they sound outrageous. Others become legend because they should never have been real in the first place. You follow the trail of COINTELPRO through a narrow passage of files and half-forgotten whispers, the kind of place where the dust feels heavier than usual, as if even the particles know they are guarding something uncomfortable. You expect familiar stories, tales of overreach and messy politics, but the deeper you walk, the more you sense a different pattern. Not chaos, not miscommunication, intent, a steady, deliberate design carried out with the calm confidence of people who believed that secrecy made them untouchable. The first folder looks harmless enough, a neat cover sheet describing counterintelligence with the tone of a polite brochure. You almost expect it to pivot into an advertisement for community safety programs. Instead, it opens into a catalog of surveillance methods that make you pause, blink, and quietly ask the room if it is serious. The pages list targets not with the careful precision of national security threats, but with the casual broadness of someone circling names in a high school yearbook. Activists, organizers, artists, students, journalists, entire groups whose greatest crimes seem to be thinking loudly in the wrong direction. You picture the agents who carried out these operations, sitting in unmarked cars with lukewarm coffee, scribbling notes on people doing completely ordinary things. A man delivering flyers, a woman answering her door, friends gathering to discuss local issues. Yet, in the eyes of COINTELPRO, these moments were not routine. They were potential sparks of unrest. You imagine the agents feeling important, watching people who had no idea the government considered their book clubs or discussion circles suspicious enough to warrant reports typed on official letterhead. You move farther into the archive and find memos describing infiltration strategies. Some read like they were drafted by people who spent too much time imagining themselves undercover in spy movies. Others are chillingly practical. Agents encouraged to sow discord within groups, spread rumors, sabotage relationships, and steer conversations away from unity. The language is oddly cheerful at times, like a team brainstorming weekend plans. Except the weekend plans involve dismantling trust among people exercising basic rights. The deeper you read, the more it becomes clear that paranoia was not a fringe mindset during those years. It was policy. Entire communities learned to lower their voices without knowing why. People glanced over their shoulders during ordinary conversations. Leaders felt betrayed without understanding that the betrayal was engineered. You sense how suffocating it must have been. The way suspicion seeped into neighborhoods like a fog that never burned off, making everyone question who was listening, who was reporting, who was quietly nudging tensions in the wrong direction. You find letters forged by officials and sent anonymously to spouses, employers, and acquaintances, each one crafted to fracture connections. You try to imagine the person typing them, adjusting the angle of the page and carefully choosing phrases designed to wound strangers. It is the kind of task that should make any rational human being stop and reconsider their career path. Yet the files suggest no hesitation, only efficiency, only follow through. You pause at a testimony recorded years later, long after the program was finally exposed. The speaker describes living through that era with a kind of weary clarity, explaining how small warnings and odd sensations added up over time. Missed mail, strange phone clicks, strangers lingering a bit too long at the edge of meetings. It makes you realize that paranoia is not always irrational. Sometimes it is simply the mind acknowledging patterns, long before official documents confirm them. You turn another page and find references to journalists who tried to uncover the truth earlier, their investigations dismissed as exaggeration or bias. Yet here, in the glow of the dim hallway, the documents line up neatly, each one validating what people suspected all along. The truth was not hidden in a labyrinth of complexity. It was sitting quietly in filing cabinets, protected more by disbelief than by security. As you reach the final section, a strange mix of emotions settles over you. There is disbelief at the scale of the operations, yes, but also a sharper recognition. Paranoia did not grow in a vacuum. It grew because people sensed something was off, because the shadows around them were not just imaginings, but the shape of an unseen hand nudging events. You realize that instincts become finely tuned in environments where secrecy thrives. That the quiet feeling of being watched is sometimes not a symptom but a warning. You close the folder softly and step back, absorbing the weight of everything you have read. COINTELPRO does not linger because it was complex. It lingers because it was simple. Surveillance, disruption, manipulation, all carried out with the confidence of people who assumed they would never be caught. You walk away with the unsettling realization that in some eras of history, the paranoid were not imagining things at all, they were paying attention. You enter the next stretch of the labyrinth expecting a breather, maybe a story about misplaced paperwork or a bungled government program that ended with a sternly worded memo. Instead, you find a folder labeled Operation Paperclip, an innocent name that sounds more like a school supply audit than a turning point in world history. You lift the cover, already sensing that whatever sits inside will challenge your belief that victory is ever as clean or triumphant as textbooks make it sound. The first pages feel straightforward enough, detailing the scramble at the end of the war, a frenzied rush among world powers to gather scientific knowledge before anyone else could. You picture defeated nations collapsing like abandoned sets, while multiple governments sifted through the debris for people who could build rockets, develop physics theories, or advance technology decades faster than expected. It feels like watching rival shoppers at a clearance sale, except the stakes are astronomical, and the moral lines are drawn in chalk that keep smudging with each decision. As you read deeper, the tone shifts. The names on the lists become familiar. Men whose work shaped major scientific breakthroughs, but whose pasts carry shadows long enough to stretch across entire generations. You pause when you recognize a name associated with atrocities, then another, the realization building slowly like a chill at the base of your neck. These were not simply brilliant scientists plucked from obscurity. Many held ranks and roles tied directly to some of the darkest chapters in human history. Yet here they were, offered new lives, new jobs, new identities, because their brilliance was deemed too valuable to leave behind. You imagine the meetings where officials weighed the cost, One side listing the potential advancements in aerospace and defense, the other side quietly clearing its throat and reminding everyone what these individuals had participated in. You try to picture the moment when someone finally said, in a tone far too calm for the situation, that perhaps the past could be overlooked for the sake of national security. You wonder if anyone looked away, unable to meet the eyes of their colleagues as lines blurred into smears. You trace the path of these scientists as they were quietly transported across oceans, some under new names, some under sealed records, all welcomed into research facilities with the sort of enthusiastic funding most honest scholars only dream of. They arrived with polished boots and carefully edited histories, stepping into laboratories that treated them not as war criminals but as assets. You feel the strange clash of disbelief and grim clarity settling over you. Sometimes the world chooses progress over principles, and sometimes the justifications are written so neatly they almost look reasonable if you do not stare too long. You read reports describing the advancements they achieved once settled into their new roles. Rockets that soared higher than anyone imagined. Scientific developments that reshaped global power. You imagine the officials walking through the labs with quiet pride, congratulating themselves on the boldness of their decisions, while the scientists worked efficiently, their pasts tucked away like old letters hidden in drawers. The strangest part is how quickly the uncomfortable details were swept aside. Public narratives praised the innovation, the rapid leaps in technology, the triumph of scientific ambition. The darker truths remained buried in classified files, emerging only when historians stumbled across them decades later. You realize that people often prefer simple stories. Good triumphs over evil. The nation wins. The future looks bright. There is little room in those stories for compromises that taste like metal when you try to swallow them. You sit with the documents spread around you, absorbing the weight of choices made in the frantic aftermath of conflict. It becomes clear that victory did not arrive as a clean, shining moment. It arrived as a negotiation, a series of quiet decisions made behind closed doors, each one nudging morality a little farther down a slippery slope. You wonder how many people knew, how many questioned it, how many convinced themselves that ends justify means if the ends are dazzling enough. You gather the papers and close the folder slowly, the spine creaking as if reluctant to seal itself again. Operation Paperclip does not leave you with outrage or shock so much as a deeper, quieter understanding that history is never as tidy as the summaries written about it. You walk away from the file with the lingering awareness that every triumph casts a shadow, and sometimes the shadow is long enough to reach you even now, stretching across decades with a reminder that progress often arrives carrying truths no one wants to look at directly. You arrive at the edge of a map that does not quite match the land. Roads appear where no one remembers paving them, and entire neighborhoods fade like pencil marks that someone tried to erase but gave up halfway through. You stand there listening to the strange silence, the kind that feels staged, like the world is holding its breath. Then you see the sign, a perfectly ordinary government notice declaring nothing in particular, and you understand that whatever lies beyond it is not meant to be noticed at all. The Manhattan Project did not simply hide its secrets. It hid the towns that held them, swallowing communities whole and spitting out new ones with fresh paint and fewer answers. You step across an invisible threshold and find yourself in a place that feels rushed into existence. Houses stand in perfect rows, each one identical enough to make you check twice before choosing a door. Streets are laid out like someone traced them with a ruler. Clean angles, sharp corners, no room for coincidence. The people move with polite smiles and careful steps, as if they too were constructed from blueprints and instructions. You realize this town is not growing, it is functioning, built not for comfort but for containment. The air carries a faint hum, maybe from machinery or from the weight of a secret too heavy for the soil to absorb. Workers pass you dressed in uniforms that avoid specifics. They head toward facilities marked only with numbers and symbols that offer no clues. You try to follow their line of sight, but it always stops just before the horizon, as if they have been trained not to look too far in any direction. You ask a question at a corner store, and the clerk answers with a smile so neutral it feels like a warning. You ask a second question, and she glances at the ceiling as if expecting it to blink back. You learn quickly that curiosity is not welcomed here. It is tolerated only when it stays quiet. Night in this place feels even stranger. Lights glow through drawn curtains, their silhouettes shifting with hurried movements. You walk past a house where a man paces with restless energy, muttering calculations under his breath, while his wife sits perfectly still, her hands folded, her eyes fixed on a single spot on the wall. They are here because someone decided they were essential, and they remain because someone else decided they were not allowed to be anywhere else. You sense the invisible threads that tie every person to this hidden town. Threads woven from obligation, fear, and hope tangled together. As you wander farther, you stumble onto the outskirts where the illusion thins. You find fences topped with wires, guarded not by signs but by silence. Beyond them stands an enormous structure that hums with purpose. You do not know what it does, only that it demands secrecy from everyone living within its radius. The closer you approach, the more you sense the magnitude of the project, a force collecting energy like a storm cloud ready to reshape the world. Yet the people here continue their routines, grocery lists, and half-finished conversations balanced against the weight of history unfolding behind locked doors. You pass a row of dormitories and overhear a whispered conversation between two young men, one insisting that the project will change everything, the other insisting it already has. They talk about theoretical physics as casually as some people discuss weather. They laugh too loudly, then fall silent too suddenly, glancing around as if expecting the air itself to take notes. You realize that no matter how brilliant they are still trapped inside a system that demands obedience over understanding. The brilliance is a tool here, not a freedom. You begin to understand how a town can vanish, not by force, but by forgetting itself. Each person slowly surrendering pieces of normal life until the place becomes nothing but a container for the classified. Birthdays go uncelebrated. Names fade. Mail arrives without return addresses. Children grow up in a world where secrets are more common than streetlights. You feel the weight of the project pressing against your chest, a reminder that war has a way of turning extraordinary ideas into demands and people into footnotes. As you leave the town, you look back to memorize the streets, knowing that when you check the map later, this place will not exist. It will be listed as empty land or forest, a quiet patch of nowhere. You realize that vanishing is not always about destruction. Sometimes it is deliberate erasure, smooth and clean, a kind of disappearance designed to keep the world from asking too many questions. And you walk away with the unsettling knowledge that entire communities can be folded into secrecy, tucked between pages of classified files, remembered only by the shadows of the people who once lived inside them. You walk into a conference room that smells faintly of stale coffee and the kind of confidence only men in expensive suits can produce. They sit in perfect posture, their smiles gentle, polished, almost parental, as if they are here to read bedtime stories rather than defend the existence of a national addiction. You watch them adjust their ties, clear their throats, and offer the press a performance so smooth you could spread it on toast. They speak about public well-being with the same tone someone might use to discuss gardening or community bake sales. Calm and reassuring, as though the question of whether cigarettes harm people were some harmless misunderstanding that would untangle itself by lunchtime. You see charts on the wall, each one designed less to inform and more to hypnotize. Bars rise and fall in cheerful colors. Tiny percentages float above them like polite decorations, and none of it tells the truth. Behind the curtain of corporate charm sits a machine crafted carefully over countless years, a system built from denial, loopholes, and so many committees that you lose track of how many desks a single lie can sit on. Scientists are hired not to discover anything, but to blur lines until even the sharpest minds start doubting their own eyesight. You watch as language itself becomes a tool, every sentence coded in the kind of ambiguity that allows a company to shrug and say, "The data is inconclusive." You meet the researchers in private conference rooms, each one armed with a stack of documents and a nervous smile. Their studies carry titles that sound responsible: observational trends, emerging patterns, ongoing evaluations. But inside the pages, you feel the weight of a truth held underwater. Findings are softened, conclusions reworded, and any evidence of harm is placed beneath so many layers of technical phrasing that it becomes unrecognizable. You can almost hear the boardroom cheer each time a paragraph loses clarity, because confusion is as good as victory when the goal is to outlast public concern. Outside, the world keeps smoking. Billboards glow over highways. Glamorous models pose with cigarettes as though holding the key to sophistication. And factory lines hum along like a heartbeat made of metal and momentum. You see doctors in old advertisements giving endorsements with earnest smiles, their white coats lending credibility that sticks to the national imagination like glue. The brilliance of the tactic feels unsettling, a campaign so elegant that you almost admire how effortlessly it replaces evidence with reassurance. Almost. Years pass, and the machine grows smarter. When people whisper about cancer, the company counters with carefully placed doubt. When researchers publish warnings, spokespeople smile and insist more studies are needed. You watch lawsuits pile up like forgotten laundry, each one buried under an avalanche of corporate denial. Smokers cough in kitchens, families worry quietly, and the empire continues to grin, insisting that everything is fine as long as the question remains technically unresolved. Then you meet the whistleblowers, the scientists who could not stand the silence anymore. They speak in low voices, not because they are uncertain, but because they understand the size of the beast they are challenging. They describe internal memos where executives discuss addiction metrics with all the warmth of someone adjusting spice levels in a recipe. They describe studies hidden in drawers, shredded reports, and boardroom celebrations when early warnings are successfully delayed. Listening to them feels like being handed a flashlight in a cave you did not know you were standing inside. The house of cards starts trembling. Documents leak, hearings begin, and suddenly the polished smiles of executives look too stiff, too rehearsed. Cameras flash as they raise their hands and swear oaths that tremble slightly at the edges. You watch them deny the addictive nature of their product with such confidence that you have to remind yourself that confidence is not the same as truth. Eventually, the machine cracks. Paper trails spill into public view and reveal the architecture of denial that had held steady for decades. The polite smiles evaporate, and what remains is a long record of decisions that valued profit over lungs, clarity, or conscience. You step back and look at the history spread out before you. It seems impossible that a conspiracy so large could survive for so long on charm alone. Yet here it stands, a monument to the power of doubt when funded well and presented with polished manners. And as the truth finally reaches the light, you feel the unsettling realization that sometimes the most dangerous secrets are wrapped not in shadows, but in smiles. You stand in a field that looks ordinary enough, the kind of place where farmers argue about soil and teenagers carve initials into old fence posts. But something feels wrong in the air. It carries a crispness that seems manufactured, a faint metallic edge that does not belong to weather born from clouds and chaos. You tilt your head and listen, and there it is, a distant mechanical pulse, like the sky practicing a secret routine it was never meant to perform. You realize the rumors you once laughed at might not have been rumors at all. Someone, somewhere, has been trying to nudge the atmosphere like a stubborn piece of machinery, and you are standing directly under the evidence. You wander toward a cluster of odd-looking towers rising from the ground like they sprouted overnight. They hum softly, releasing bursts of energy that flicker through the air with the confidence of someone adjusting a dimmer switch on the sun. You think of old conspiracy theories you once heard whispered at diners alongside bottomless coffee. Wild stories about manipulating storms and engineering rainfall. Back then, it sounded like science fiction assembled by people who collected newspaper clippings with too much enthusiasm. Now, watching the sky ripple above these devices, you feel a soft nudge of unease. Maybe those clippings were not cautionary tales, but early drafts of the truth. A technician walks past you wearing a badge with an abbreviation that seems designed purely to avoid further questions. He taps a panel, checks a meter, and nods to himself as though cloud behavior can be measured like water pressure. You try to ask what the machine does, but he offers you a polite smile that carries the universal message of please stop talking. Government secrecy always has that particular sheen to it, not aggressive, just gently closed, like a door that pretends it is unlocked until you actually try turning the handle. The technician walks off, leaving you with more questions and the unmistakable feeling that the atmosphere above you is no longer entirely natural. Cloud seeding, weather modification, experimental atmospheric influence. The terms echo in your mind as you watch planes trace long silver lines across the sky. They move with purpose, carving patterns that no flock of birds could replicate. Each line disperses slowly, fading into the clouds as if whispering instructions. You imagine the meetings where such ideas were first proposed, rooms filled with confident officials saying things like controlled precipitation and strategic climate influence, while avoiding the phrase, "We are going to poke the sky and hope it behaves." You picture charts with arrows and diagrams that look more like board game strategies than meteorology. And you wonder how many people raised their hands enthusiastically before anyone considered consequences. Rain has always been unpredictable. A friend one day and a forgotten appointment the next. You used to think that was part of nature's charm, but standing here, you realize nature may have been given a friendly shove from behind. You feel the breeze shift, carrying droplets that appear before any cloud should have given permission. It is soft, almost hesitant, like the sky is testing new choreography. People nearby take shelter and do not seem to notice anything strange, because strange, when introduced slowly enough, begins to pass for normal. Years of experiments unfold in your mind, stories of droughts that suddenly broke because someone sprinkled silver iodide in the clouds, or storms that fizzled mysteriously just short of where disaster was predicted. You recall hearing about these projects buried inside documents and footnotes, explained away as small-scale experiments, harmless trials. But looking at the machinery around you, you understand that whenever an agency describes something as harmless, it usually means they hope it will be. You also understand why so many people kept their windows closed whenever the government announced a test, not out of fear, but out of that quiet instinct humans have when they sense something is happening above their heads that they were never asked to vote on. Thunder rumbles somewhere far off, low and uncertain, like a throat clearing before a confession. The sky darkens slowly, its edges smudged by influences you cannot see but can definitely feel. You wonder if any experimenter ever stood exactly where you are now, watching their own machinery rewrite a patch of weather and thinking this might be fine. That is the problem with pushing boundaries. Sometimes success feels just safe enough to encourage the next experiment, and the next, until the line between study and strategy becomes too thin to separate. As you turn to leave, a gust of wind rushes past you, sharper than nature usually allows. It carries an aftertaste of something metallic, subtle but unmistakable. You pull your jacket tighter and close your windows when you get home, not because you expect anything dramatic, but because your instincts whisper that the sky is learning new tricks. And wherever humans teach nature to behave differently, surprises tend to follow. You sit by the window as the unfamiliar rain begins to fall, listening to the strange rhythm and wondering how many storms in history were not born from clouds, but from ideas. You slip into a dim editing room where the only sources of light are a glowing monitor and the faint halo of dust drifting through a projector beam. It smells like coffee, old carpet, and the quiet panic of deadlines, the usual ingredients of filmmaking. But tonight the atmosphere carries something else, a subtle tension, a sense that another set of eyes has been here before you. You sit down, rewind the footage, and there it is, tucked neatly between explosions and soaring orchestral music, a patriotic montage so tidy it feels pre-ironed. You used to laugh about the idea of intelligence agencies whispering into Hollywood's ear, convinced it belonged near lizard people and secret moon bases. Now, As you lean closer to the screen, the theory feels less ridiculous and more like an inside joke someone forgot to tell you. Your hands rest on the console while you scan through script notes left behind by previous teams. One page contains a suspicious number of redactions, as if the hero's backstory were a matter of national security. You trace the edits, noticing how certain scenes were removed entirely, replaced by vague dialogue that flatters institutions with the grace of a well-rehearsed public relations campaign. You feel the uncanny sensation that this film, the one you have watched a dozen times and memorized out of nostalgia, has been gently adjusted by people whose job descriptions rarely include cinematography. You walk outside onto the studio lot, past sound stages painted with cheerful murals of smiling actors. In the corner, you notice a small office with a simple plaque, one that blends in so thoroughly you almost overlook it. Inside, a handful of employees sit at desks cluttered with movie posters and government-style paperwork. They flip through scripts with careful concentration, highlighting scenes, scribbling suggestions, and making polite phone calls that begin with phrases like, "We love what you are doing, but," and "we can help you get access to equipment if." You realize quickly that these are not interns. These are liaisons, the kind who never raise their voices because they never need to. They operate with a delicate touch, offering resources, props, and consultation anytime a filmmaker wants realism. You watch a director step into the room carrying a screenplay about covert operations. He leaves smiling, grateful for technical accuracy, unaware or perfectly aware that accuracy has a way of guiding a story's direction. You see how easy it is to shape narratives when the assistance arrives wrapped in helpfulness. No threats, no shadowy briefcases, just quiet influence delivered in the tone of a friendly neighbor who also happens to own half the tools in town. You wander past a warehouse filled with replica gear, some of it borrowed from real facilities. A staff member demonstrates how certain equipment is used, his instructions casual, his posture military, even on his day off. He explains that cooperation between film studios and government agencies helps ensure positive representation. He says it so matter-of-factly that you have to remind yourself this used to sound like a conspiracy. Most viewers never notice. They watch movies, cheer for the heroes, feel the patriotic swell during the montage, and never question why certain details are always portrayed with the same glossy perfection. Back in the editing room, you replay a chase scene where the protagonist dodges danger with impeccable timing. The cinematography is stunning, the script tight, the message clear, but now you notice the subtleties. The agency logos framed at flattering angles, the moral clarity tidied until it sparkles, the complexity of real geopolitics trimmed down until it fits comfortably between product placements. You think about the filmmakers who pushed back, insisting on nuance, only to be told cooperation was conditional on the portrayal remaining palatable. You wonder how many scripts were quietly rewritten in exchange for access to aircraft, agencies, or classified. Know how that could be transformed into cinematic spectacle. The projector whirs softly as the montage plays again. Flags flutter, agents stride with confidence. Operations unfold with cleanliness that never exists outside studio walls. You sit still, absorbing the quiet revelation that influence rarely arrives wearing a trench coat. It prefers subtlety, the soft press of a finger guiding a narrative towards safer ground, all while smiling for cameras and calling it collaboration. You pause the frame and stare into the frozen hero's determined face, realizing the line between fiction and guidance is thinner than you ever imagined. And as the machine hums behind you, you understand why some conspiracies survive. Not because they stretch reality too far, but because sometimes they do not stretch it at all. You find yourself wandering through a maze of filing cabinets and clunky tape recorders, the kind with buttons large enough to press accidentally if a sleeve brushed against them. The room smells faintly of paper, carpet glue, and the distinct panic of men who thought they were smarter than the system, but underestimated how loudly a machine can click when it starts recording. You push past a stack of old transcripts and step into the world of Watergate, A place where power stumbles, not because of some brilliant investigator or dramatic confession, but because someone, somewhere, forgot to hang up a phone. You picture the break-in first, the moment when a small group of operatives crept through the quiet halls, lit only by emergency bulbs. They move with the confidence of people who watch too many spy shows and convince themselves they could replicate the choreography. They fiddle with locks, clip wires, and snap photos, unaware that history is already circling like a hawk above their heads. You imagine one of them whispering instructions while trying not to knock over a plant or set off an alarm that definitely looks older than the building itself. It should have been a small scandal at most, a footnote in political mischief. But then the phone line crackled, the recording started, and the entire operation unraveled stitch by stitch. You move closer to a dusty reel-to-reel machine, its spools resting like relics. You press play, and the room fills with the muted static of a conversation that should never have existed in the first place. Voices drift through the speakers, calm, calculated, occasionally interrupted by the soft thud of a hand tapping a desk. You can hear the confidence, the certainty that what they were planning would remain sealed behind closed doors. Men at the height of power speaking as if the country were merely an audience to be managed, not a population to be accountable to. And in the middle of it all, the quiet evidence preserved because someone forgot the simplest step. End the call, stop the tape, hang up the phone. You walk through the timeline, watching events unravel with a kind of tragic comedy. Reporters start tugging on loose threads, expecting them to break off in their hands. Instead, every thread leads to another, then another, forming a path right back to the Oval Office. Meetings become frantic, memos multiply. People start sweating through their collars. The very system these men believed they had mastered begins to turn against them, not out of vengeance, but out of the mundane reliability of office equipment that does exactly what it was designed to do: preserve, record, remember. You step into a dim corridor where once secret conversations echo like whispered warnings. Advisors pace while scratching notes onto yellow pads, trying to piece together excuses inventive enough to satisfy the public. The walls feel heavy with tension, every surface carrying the imprint of desperation. You can almost hear the frantic questions bouncing through the room. Who else knows? How much was recorded? Why did no one check the machine? The answers linger in the air, too obvious to say aloud. The investigations intensify. Senators lean closer into microphones. Journalists dig deeper. Every attempt to patch the story only reveals another crack. You stand in the middle of it all, watching as loyalty shifts into self-preservation and silence splinters under pressure. You imagine one official lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling while replaying the sound of that fateful click, the one that captured words meant to vanish into memory instead of magnetic tape. You listen as the tapes are analyzed, paused, rewound, dissected. Long conversations, short comments, awkward pauses, all of it preserved with the unwavering honesty of a machine that has no allegiance. When the smoking gun finally surfaces, it does not arrive with cinematic flair or dramatic music. It is simply a recording, a voice saying too much, a moment where power betrays itself. You feel the weight of it, that quiet realization that truth sometimes survives, not through courage or persistence, but through a small, human mistake. You step back from the final tape, letting the silence settle around you. Watergate feels less like a grand unraveling and more like a reminder that even the most carefully constructed facades can crumble if a single detail slips through the cracks. As you walk away, you glance at the telephone resting on the desk, its receiver hanging slightly crooked, and the thought presses gently against your mind. Sometimes history shifts because someone forgot to end the call. You enter a small, windowless office, stacked with files that look harmless enough, their beige covers blending into the walls like they are trying desperately not to be noticed. You reach for one labeled with a string of numbers that could pass for a badly chosen Wi-Fi password. The moment you open it, a chill runs through you. Not because of the classified stamp or the dense paragraphs written in bureaucratic code, but because the first sentence casually mentions radiation exposure, the way someone might mention light rain in a weekend forecast. You blink, then read it again, hoping it will rearrange itself into something less alarming. It does not. You keep reading, following a trail of documents that feels stranger with every page. The experiments described here are not tucked into remote deserts or high-security bunkers. They happened in hospitals, clinics, neighborhoods where people lived ordinary lives, unaware that someone in a distant office had decided they were perfect candidates for scientific research. You picture the citizens featured in these files, people who thought they were receiving routine treatment or participating in harmless studies, completely unaware that someone was quietly testing the effects of radiation on their bodies, as if they were living chalkboards waiting for equations to be written across them. The tone of the paperwork is calm and tidy, which somehow makes everything worse. The researchers discuss dosage levels and exposure times with the same polite precision you expect from a recipe for muffins. None of the sentences carry urgency. No one expresses doubt. Instead, you find lines like "subject tolerated the procedure well," which translates loosely to "we did something questionable and the person did not immediately fall over." You pause, trying to imagine how anyone signed off on these decisions without feeling their conscience tap them on the shoulder. You picture the meetings where these plans were approved. A room full of officials leaning over diagrams, adjusting their glasses, nodding thoughtfully as charts displayed projected outcomes. They speak in the smooth language of scientific advancement, neglecting the small detail that the subjects were never asked whether they wanted to participate in the advancement. You imagine one of them stirring sugar into his coffee while suggesting a higher dose next time, completely unfazed by the implications. That is the unsettling part. Not the experiments themselves, but the mundanity of the choices leading to them. You find accounts of patients injected with radioactive materials under the guise of helpful treatment. Families told not to worry. Everything is perfectly routine. You read letters from people who trusted the professionals tending to them, blissfully unaware their names were being added to data tables, measuring how long radiation lingers in bone or blood. You feel a knot forming in your stomach as you turn the page, each detail more surreal than the last. It is one thing to uncover a conspiracy. It is another to realize the conspiracy wore a lab coat and carried a clipboard. As you continue scanning the files, you discover the experiments were not isolated incidents, but part of a larger web. Military personnel, pregnant women, disabled children. The list stretches across demographics with unsettling ease. The government did not target specific types of people. It simply used whoever seemed available, like choosing ingredients from a pantry without checking whether they belonged in the recipe. You feel the air grow heavier as you read, a weight pressing on your chest that has nothing to do with radiation and everything to do with the quiet cruelty of indifference. You take a break, stepping away from the desk, but the details follow you no matter where you look. The hallway feels colder, the lights seem harsher, even your own skin prickles, as if reacting to the knowledge rather than the environment. You glance at a break room microwave and feel a flicker of distrust you cannot quite shake. It hums innocently, but after reading what you have, you begin to question every device that claims to safely cook anything. You think about your leftover popcorn at home and suddenly wonder how confidently you should be eating anything heated by invisible waves. When you return to the file, you notice something else. The truth did not surface because someone confessed. It surfaced because too many people began asking the same questions, their curiosity gathering like a storm until the secrecy finally buckled under its own weight. Journalists dug deeper, victims spoke out, documents leaked, and the carefully maintained silence collapsed. You trace the timeline and feel a strange mixture of anger and awe. Anger at how long the truth stayed buried. Awe at the persistence required to unearth it. You close the folder, feeling the texture of the worn cardboard beneath your fingertips. It seems too light to contain so much darkness. As you walk away from the office, you cannot help glancing at the sky, the lights, the appliances, every piece of technology that hums quietly in the background of daily life. And for the first time, you understand why some people keep one eyebrow permanently raised when the government assures them something is completely safe. You step into a corridor that feels too clean, too quiet, the kind of silence that does not belong to places where people laugh or heal. The tiles echo faintly under your shoes, each step reminding you that you are walking into a history no one asks to remember. You reach a door marked only with a number, as if withholding a label could soften whatever is inside. You push it open and find a room filled with metal cabinets and yellowing charts, the remnants of a world where medical research carried a different meaning behind locked walls. You skim the first page, and your stomach tightens as you realize you are reading about experiments carried out on prisoners who never had the chance to say no. The documents begin with the usual bureaucratic politeness, outlining objectives that sound sterile and respectable. Then the language shifts. Words like volunteer appear so frequently and so unconvincingly, you almost laugh before the weight of it settles over you. You imagine the men behind those forms, sitting in cramped rooms, handed paperwork that promised treatment or reduced sentences. You imagine the guards watching from the corners, the pressure that hung in the air, the unspoken message that refusal was not an option anyone recommended. The officials writing these reports describe the subjects clinically, reducing them to data points and reaction logs. You feel something twist inside you as you read descriptions of medications tested at doses that would never be approved outside these walls. Procedures performed without proper explanation, illnesses induced deliberately just to observe how they spread or how they could be treated. You picture the prisoners lying awake at night, realizing too late they were not patients, but ingredients in someone else's scientific ambition. You walk deeper into the archive, finding accounts of drugs tested long before they were ready, vaccinations administered with more hope than caution, treatments that blurred the line between research and punishment. Some notes mention side effects so severe they seem impossible to dismiss. Yet the researchers simply marked the outcomes with calm strokes of a pen, adding asterisks and footnotes like they were labeling plants in a garden. You try to picture how anyone rationalized this, how they convinced themselves that the walls around the prison also blocked out the concept of consent. A stack of memos catches your attention, outlining partnerships between medical institutions and correctional facilities. You read about universities requesting access to inmate populations, hospitals sending researchers to conduct studies they could never justify in public clinics. You see budgets, approvals, correspondence exchanged with the smooth efficiency of people arranging a conference rather than human experimentation. You imagine boardroom meetings where someone cleared their throat and suggested the prison population could be helpful, and no one at the table asked the obvious question. You pause at a letter from a prisoner who wrote to complain about worsening symptoms after a procedure. His handwriting tilts unevenly, like he struggled to hold the pen steady. He asks what was done to him, why he has not been allowed to see a doctor unaffiliated with the study, why the pain keeps spreading. Attached is a note from the researcher dismissing the complaint as unrelated. You feel your chest tighten as you read the casual sentence, the indifference contained in each syllable. You flip through more files, each one revealing another layer of a system that operated quietly, almost efficiently, because the people affected were tucked out of sight and stripped of the power to object. The experiments continued for years, shifting locations, names, and methodologies, each new version cloaked in justification about rehabilitation or advancing medical knowledge. You realize how easy it was for officials to hide behind those explanations, how simple it became to ignore public ethics when the public was never meant to know. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not come from confessions or sudden moral clarity. It leaked through investigative work, lawsuits, and the persistence of families who demanded answers. You imagine the shock when the country learned what had been done, the disbelief that slowly gave way to anger, the hearings where officials tried to soften their involvement with vague apologies. But no hearing transcript can mute the sound of what happened behind those locked doors. You close the cabinet, feeling the faint smell of disinfectant still clinging to the papers, as if the past is trying to sanitize itself. You step back into the hallway, thinking about every health form you have ever signed, every clause you skimmed quickly, without imagining how far consent could be stretched or distorted. You breathe in the stale air and understand why suspicion grows so easily in places where trust was broken long before anyone realized it needed protecting. You walk into a dim room where the air smells faintly of carbon paper and old carpet, the kind of space that seems permanently stuck in a year no one remembers fondly. Filing cabinets line the walls like silent sentries, each drawer labeled with codes instead of names, as if the past still wants to pretend it was tidy. You pull one open and find folders stuffed with surveillance logs that should never have existed in the first place. Neatly typed reports describe movements, conversations, and private moments belonging to people who posed no threat except to the comfort of those in power. You feel a slow, rising heaviness in your chest as you flip through pages detailing the lives of civil rights leaders who were watched more closely than criminals. The reports begin with calm professionalism, almost clinical in tone. Agents describe the subjects leaving homes, attending meetings, speaking with neighbors. It sounds harmless until you realize how much detail is recorded. How many hours were devoted to cataloging actions that were not suspicious but simply human? You picture the leaders at their desks, drafting speeches or planning marches, unaware that someone 2 blocks away was writing down every time a light turned on in their office window. You imagine the agents crouched in unmarked cars, sipping lukewarm coffee, staring through binoculars at homes where families tried to live ordinary lives under extraordinary scrutiny. As you move deeper into the files, the language shifts. The tone becomes sharper, filled with hints of fear disguised as authority. The government convinced itself that these leaders were destabilizing forces simply because they demanded dignity, equality, and justice. You see memos urging supervisors to collect anything that might discredit them. Anything. The word sits on the page like a stone, heavy enough to bend the paper. You imagine the meetings where these strategies were discussed. Rooms full of officials who believed the best way to protect the nation was to undermine the people trying to improve it. You find transcripts of phone calls, typed line by line, capturing fragments of private conversations never meant for public eyes. You feel a jolt of discomfort reading them, the same unease that comes when you realize someone has skimmed through your journal or scrolled through messages you never intended to share. These leaders spoke about hopes, fears, schedules, and family. None of it was criminal, yet all of it was collected as if the government expected a confession to appear spontaneously between grocery lists and travel plans. You discover a memo outlining attempts to sow distrust within the movement. Letters were forged, rumors were planted, anonymous messages were sent with the subtlety of a brick through glass, each one carefully crafted to fracture relationships and weaken momentum. You pause and imagine receiving a letter designed to destroy the trust you built with friends. Knowing the words were crafted by someone who had never met you, you can almost feel the confusion that must have followed, the quiet hurt, the suspicion that someone close had turned against you. The scale of the operation becomes clearer with every document. Dozens of agents assigned to one person, round-the-clock surveillance, recordings stored in boxes stacked so high they could form a wall. You picture the leaders trying to sleep at night, wondering if the shadows outside their windows were just shadows or something more deliberate. You imagine them stepping onto stages to speak, knowing well that every microphone might double as an ear for a government that feared their influence more than it feared injustice. As you continue reading, you begin to understand how suspicion becomes a survival skill. Not paranoia, not fear, but simple, necessary vigilance. You see how these leaders moved carefully, choosing words with precision, trusting selectively, because the wrong confidant could mean sabotage, exposure, or danger. Their persistence feels even more remarkable when you realize how many forces worked quietly to silence them. The courage required to stand in public becomes immense when private life is no longer private at all. You reach the end of one particularly unsettling report and close the folder slowly, as if the paper might sting. The room feels heavier now, filled with the echoes of voices recorded without permission, protests monitored through binoculars, and futures debated in rooms where none of the subjects were invited. You try to reconcile the official justification written in these files with the reality pressed into every page. It does not balance. It never will. You step back from the cabinet, the fluorescent lights flickering slightly overhead, and you feel a quiet understanding settle in your chest. Suspicion was not a flaw during that era. It was protection. It was awareness sharpened by necessity, a shield forged against those who insisted they were only doing their jobs. And as you leave the room, you carry with you the unsettling truth that sometimes the greatest threats to freedom come from those who claim to defend it. You sit at a table buried beneath towers of photocopies, the kind that still smell faintly of warm ink even after decades of storage. The room hums with that soft, fluorescent buzz that makes everything feel both ordinary and slightly unreal, as if you have stumbled into an office supply closet where history accidentally tripped and spilled its secrets all over the floor. You reach for a thick binder labeled with a nondescript code, and the moment you flip it open, the hum behind you fades. The air sharpens. Every page holds the quiet tension of truths that were never meant to be read by anyone outside a windowless meeting room in Washington. At first, the documents look harmless, just the usual polished paragraphs of government language that says everything and nothing at the same time. But you lean closer and begin to see the contradictions tucked between the lines, the disparity between what officials told the public and what they wrote when no cameras were watching. Reports describe strategies that contradict speeches, assessments that contradict press conferences, casualties that contradict the optimistic forecasts repeated with practiced ease. You feel a strange shift inside you as the gap widens, the difference between truth and public narrative stretching like fabric pulled too tight. You trace the path of the papers as they travel through hands far braver than yours. Analysts and researchers hunched over desks, realizing that the story of the war unfolding outside was not the story being recorded within these pages. You picture one of them pausing with a pen halfway to the margin, trying to decide whether to question the numbers or ignore the knot forming in his chest. He chooses to look closer, and once he sees it, he cannot unsee it. The same knot grows in you now, twisting tighter the deeper you read. Then you find the moment everything shifts, described simply, without fanfare. A researcher makes the decision to copy the documents, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly, with the patience of someone watering seeds he hopes will someday grow into accountability. You imagine him feeding page after page through a copier that groans under the weight of classified history. The room silent except for the rhythmic clack of the machine producing evidence the world was never intended to hold. You follow the trail to the journalists who first received the stack. You can almost feel the tension in their newsroom, the electric mixture of disbelief and duty as they sifted through report after report, realizing the magnitude of what they held. You imagine the argument that must have taken place, voices rising, hands gesturing, the impossible question hovering in the air. Publish or stay silent, preserve safety or reveal truth. You watch the moment the decision tips in favor of disclosure, not because it is easy, but because it is necessary. The fallout unfolds like a slow-moving avalanche. Officials scramble, phones ring at all hours. Meetings erupt behind closed doors where faces tighten and voices sharpen. Attempts to stop the publication multiply, but each new article hits the public like a jolt of electricity. You see citizens reading the headlines, eyes widening as the polished narrative they were fed fractures in their hands. The truth spreads faster than the efforts to contain it, breaking through newspapers, television broadcasts, living rooms, and kitchen tables. You notice something remarkable in those pages. It is not just the revelations themselves, but the tone. Detached, methodical, factual. The truth does not shout. It does not need to. It simply exists. And that presence alone rearranges everything it touches. You feel that shift inside you again. A quiet but undeniable click, as if some part of your mind has snapped into alignment. You flip through the final pages, absorbing the full arc of the story. The secrecy, the deception, the courage, the exposure. You realize that truth does not always burst through doors or arrive with sirens. Sometimes it escapes like a steady pulse, page by page, until the weight of it becomes impossible to ignore. It does not need drama. It only needs daylight. You close the binder slowly, your fingertips tingling with the echo of everything you have read. And in that stillness, you feel the satisfying snap of truth finally breaking free. Not as a triumphant shout, but as a steady, unyielding breath the public had been denied for far too long. You step into a maze of documents so chaotic they look like a filing cabinet sneezed. Everywhere you turn, there are diagrams of supply routes, memos filled with half-sentences, and signatures that appear only when convenient. You pick up a folder and instantly feel like you have stumbled into a plot so convoluted it should come with a corkboard and red string. This is the Iran-Contra scandal, a story that seems to have been stitched together by people who believed secrecy could survive on enthusiasm alone. You begin with the basics, or at least what should be the basics, but even those twist themselves into knots. Weapons sent here, money moved there, statements delivered with the calm confidence of men who genuinely believed no one would cross-reference anything. You watch the narrative unfold like a magician performing a trick too complicated for his own hands. On one side, officials insisting they were standing firm on principles. On the other, the unmistakable trail of receipts suggesting someone forgot what the principles were supposed to be. You follow the path of weapons first, tracing the shipment logs that read like the world's most irresponsible shopping list. Missiles moved quietly across borders under the guise of diplomacy, sold with a wink and a nod, as if the whole affair were a casual yard sale rather than an international operation. You imagine the officials signing the approvals, sliding documents into folders, telling themselves this was temporary, strategic, manageable. They probably thought the files would sit forever inside drawers no one bothered to open. Then you turn to the money, which behaves less like currency and more like a restless spirit, drifting through accounts in ways that defy geography and common sense. Funds vanish, reappear, double back, and resurface in places no financial advisor would ever recommend. It feels like trying to track a misbehaving house cat through a tunnel system you did not know existed. You follow each line item until you hit another coded entry, another vague description, another moment where you stare at the page and wonder if the entire plan was invented during a lunch break. You picture the meetings where this operation took shape, a room full of officials wearing expressions that suggest confidence but reveal mild panic around the edges. They sketch out ideas on notepads, fold the pages neatly, and convince themselves they have masterminded something elegant. You can almost hear one of them saying it will never get traced back to us, a statement that should never be spoken out loud in any room with working lighting, yet they say it anyway, because optimism can be blinding when no one bothers to open the blinds. As you read letters describing covert aid routed through channels with names so vague they might as well have been chosen by a committee of sleep-deprived interns, you start to understand why the scandal eventually burst into public view. It is not that someone talked too much. It is that the entire web was woven with threads too frayed to hold. Every attempt to conceal one layer exposed another. Every denial prompted a question. Every question led to a document that should have been shredded years ago. You find testimonies from officials speaking carefully in hearings, offering explanations that hover somewhere between baffled innocence and strategic forgetfulness. They adjust their glasses, shuffle their papers, and claim they do not recall details that most people would remember forever if they had been involved. You listen to their voices in your imagination, steady yet cracking at the edges as the story grows too heavy to carry. You picture them leaning back in their chairs, realizing too late that the tangle they helped create has become impossible to flatten. And still, the information leaked. Not as a dramatic explosion, but as a steady drip of inconvenient honesty. Reports emerged, then counter-reports, then classified documents released with the kind of timing that guarantees headaches for anyone attempting to maintain a coherent narrative. You watch journalists chase the details, piecing together the scattered shards until a blurry but undeniable picture forms. The public stares at the unfolding drama, trying to understand how something this labyrinthine ever operated long enough to warrant an investigation. You close the final folder and lean back, feeling the hum of fluorescent lights press around you. The Iran-Contra scandal does not unravel in a straight line. It comes apart in spirals, loops, dead ends, and sudden bursts of clarity that snap into place like puzzle pieces you did not realize were missing. And as you walk away from the table, you wonder how the truth ever reached daylight without collapsing under its own weight. It is almost miraculous, in a chaotic, unintentional way, that the story reached the world intact at all. You enter a dim archive room where the smell of aging paper sits heavy in the air, that familiar blend of ink, dust, and secrets no one bothered to bury deeply enough. A stack of folders waits on a desk as if expecting you, their edges frayed from being handled too many times by people who pretended not to be curious. You open the first file and immediately feel the soft tug of disbelief, the kind that whispers, surely this cannot be real, even as the evidence lies right in front of you. The title on the cover is simple, almost innocent: Operation Mockingbird. You half expect it to be a literary program or an initiative to encourage songbird conservation. Then the first memo hits you like cold water. Agents, journalists, editors, entire newsrooms threaded together with invisible strings, not coerced, not threatened, but persuaded with the kind of subtle pressure only bureaucratic confidence can produce. You picture the early meetings in quiet offices, where men with meticulous haircuts leaned back in their chairs and explained, in perfectly reasonable tones, that shaping public perception was not manipulation, but rather a helpful service. After all, information is delicate. Why leave it to chance? You imagine how easily the logic spread, like a polite invitation that somehow turned into a web. You turn the page and find lists of correspondents who were recruited to deliver messages, influence narratives, or nudge certain stories gently out of the spotlight. Some participated knowingly, embracing the partnership with a kind of smug patriotism. Others suspected, then pretended not to. A few never realized they had become tools in a game much larger than their bylines. You sit with that for a moment, imagining a journalist typing an article, while an unseen hand shapes the tone through suggestions phrased as friendly guidance. The realization settles over you slowly, like the dimming of a lamp that you did not notice was fading until the room grew dark. You wander deeper into the file, uncovering letters exchanged between agencies and editors, written in language so polite it borders on unsettling. Phrases like "appreciate your cooperation" and "ensure alignment" slip across the page with the ease of well-practiced diplomacy. You picture these letters arriving in newsrooms that already buzzed with deadlines, the requests folded seamlessly into the daily workload, until the line between independent reporting and quiet influence became almost indistinguishable. You imagine the press rooms of that era, full of clacking typewriters and cigarette smoke, reporters chasing leads while unknowingly sharing desks with stories crafted miles away by people whose job was to steer the national mood. You feel a strange mixture of admiration and alarm reading through the memos. Admiration for the sheer scope of coordination. Alarm for the simplicity of the methods. It takes surprisingly little effort to steer public thought when stories flow through channels that already shape the way people see the world. You come across a section describing foreign operations. Journalists placed abroad not just to observe events, but to influence them. They interviewed officials, wrote dispatches, and passed information up and down the chain with the casual confidence of world travelers who believed their observations were entirely their own. You imagine them scribbling notes inside bustling cafes, unaware that their work would be filtered, edited, or redirected long before reaching the public. The deeper you go, the stranger it feels to hold a newspaper in your hands. Those old columns, written with such authority, now seem like artifacts whose edges have blurred. You remember mornings sipping coffee over headlines you trusted without question, unaware that entire narratives might have been shaped by people who never stepped inside a newsroom. You think about the gentle power of suggestion, how it can slip through editorials, interviews, even the placement of a story on the page. You pause at a section outlining how the operation eventually fractured under its own weight. Too many moving parts, too many quiet whispers, too many journalists pulling away once they realized they were carrying someone else's message. And then the investigations began, each revelation peeling back layers that had grown too thick to hide. Papers published cautious mea culpas. Officials spoke in circles. Public trust wobbled like a table with uneven legs. You closed the file slowly, letting out a breath you did not realize you were holding. The room feels different now. Quieter, as if the fluorescent lights are embarrassed to be shining on such honesty. You step back from the desk and picture a newspaper sitting innocently on a doorstep, its pages fluttering in the breeze as if unaware of the history tucked inside its lineage. You do not distrust the news entirely, but something soft inside you shifts. A gentle, affectionate suspicion, the kind you reserve for a friend who swears they have absolutely never spilled a secret, even though you know they sometimes talk in their sleep. And as you walk away, you realize that some conspiracies do not shatter your belief in the world. They simply remind you to tilt your head, squint slightly, and read between the lines. You step into the shadowed corners of the Prohibition era and immediately feel as though you have wandered into a party where everyone is pretending to have fun while quietly checking the exits. The streets hum with hidden exchanges, whispered passwords, and the clink of bottles passed from hand to hand under the illusion of discretion. Somewhere a jazz trumpet wails with full confidence that no law can silence it, but beneath the music lies an unease you can almost taste. You follow the trail of rumors about poisoned alcohol, expecting exaggeration, expecting folklore. Instead, you find a truth sharp enough to sting. You walk past a shuttered bar, its door locked but its windows glowing faintly as if daring you to knock. Inside, a bartender polishes glasses that never seem to get clean, each one filled earlier with spirits distilled in basements and attics across the country. He warns his patrons in lowered tones that some batches are risky, that the latest shipment might have a bite stronger than intended. You imagine the patrons laughing it off, raising their glasses anyway, because what is life without a little danger when half the country is pretending it does not drink at all? Then you turn toward the industrial side of the story, the one whispered far less romantically. Factories produce alcohol meant for varnish, fuel, and cleaning fluid. Each batch carefully denatured with chemicals to keep people from turning it into something you would pour into a glass. But people do exactly that, transforming industrial supply into bootleg liquor with the ingenuity of citizens determined to outsmart the law. The government knows this. Officials watch the numbers climb, the seizures multiply, the chemistry experiments flourish in bathtubs and makeshift stills. And someone, somewhere, decides that the solution is simple. Make the industrial alcohol even harder to cleanse. Make it dangerous enough that people will stop trying. You read about the additives poured into barrels at the direction of authorities, substances harsh enough to strip paint and far too harsh to pass through a human body. Wood alcohol, bittering agents, chemical cocktails designed to discourage consumption, but often disguised poorly enough that an eager bootlegger would try anyway. You picture the men in small apartments, boiling mixtures on stoves, trying to transform poison into drinkable gin with optimism and second-hand instructions. You imagine them sniffing the result, nodding proudly, and selling it with a grin that hides how little certainty anyone actually has about its safety. The effects ripple outward. Hospitals fill with people who thought they were drinking a cheap thrill and instead swallow something disastrous. Doctors scratch their heads, then stop scratching once the pattern becomes unmistakable. You hear the echo of their frustration, their disbelief, their anger at how preventable the whole mess should have been. You imagine the nightly chaos in emergency rooms where victims arrive with blurred vision, burning throats, and symptoms no weekend celebration should ever cause. Then you picture the government officials who hear the reports and choose to frame the casualties not as tragedies, but as unfortunate consequences of bad behavior. You see their tidy desks, their neatly pressed suits, their logic that insists the public will learn if the lesson is painful enough. You want to lean across their conference table and ask whether they ever tasted the drinks they condemned, or whether they relied entirely on diagrams and distance to justify the suffering. You walk into a speakeasy hidden behind a false wall, the music vibrating through the floorboards. The patrons dance because the alternative is thinking too hard about what they are drinking. A server hands you a glass that glows faintly amber in the dim light. You stare at it for a long moment. The room spins with laughter, the illusion of rebellion, the insistence that no law can stop joy. But now you see the invisible shadow hanging over every toast, every shot poured in celebration. You set the drink down, earning a puzzled look from the server who has seen far braver fools. The truth follows you out into the night air. It is not the drama of a villain twirling a mustache or a criminal mastermind inventing toxins in a basement. It is something colder and far more ordinary. Policy decisions, chemical formulas, the collision of human stubbornness and government desperation. You realize that conspiracies do not always arrive wrapped in secrecy. Sometimes they are written plainly in ledgers and lab notes, their consequences echoing through alleyways and emergency rooms until the entire country can feel the sting. As you walk away, the moon glints off a discarded bottle in the gutter. You give it a wide berth, not out of superstition but out of newly earned caution. From this point on, every mysterious beverage carries a whisper of history, and you find yourself checking labels with the vigilance of someone who knows exactly what once lurked inside a glass raised for a simple, dangerous toast. You enter a stretch of desert where the sky seems too large and the silence too deliberate, as if the wind itself has been instructed not to talk. The sand crunches beneath your feet with the uneasy crispness of a place that remembers more than it tells. And you realize quickly that this is not ordinary quiet. This is curated quiet. A hush so thick it feels arranged, as though someone once swept through this landscape with a broom made of redacted documents and vague explanations. You step deeper into the zone of silence, the strange mental territory that surrounds the Roswell story, and the air begins to shimmer with the peculiar energy of a mystery that has been rearranged so many times that even the confusion has become part of the design. You follow faint tire tracks in the dust, imagining the vehicles that once sped through this very stretch under the cover of night, headlights dimmed, engines too loud for what they were supposedly recovering. The official explanations echo in your mind, all neat phrasing and confident tones, describing nothing more exotic than a weather device brought down by chance. But the more you walk, the more you feel the slight tug of inconsistency, like a thread sticking out of a sweater. It invites you to pull, to just tug a little, even though you know the entire story might unravel in your hands. At a lonely patch of desert, you find an old wooden post, slanted like it has been listening to decades of whispered theories. You imagine the rancher who first spotted strange debris scattered across his land. He probably picked up fragments with a frown, wondering why the wreckage glimmered oddly in the sunlight, or refused to bend the way ordinary metal should. You picture him driving into town, telling a clerk or a sheriff about what he found, not realizing he had just stepped into a narrative that the government would spend years rearranging like a magician swapping cards under a velvet cloth. The first reports came quickly, eager, almost triumphant, claiming something unusual had fallen from the sky. You can almost hear the excitement in those early broadcasts, the sense that something historic had happened in a dusty corner of the country most people had never heard of. Then, just as quickly, the tone shifted. New statements replaced the old ones. The same officials who had spoken too soon now spoke very differently, with almost suspicious poise. The wreckage was mundane. The story was exaggerated. Everyone should calm down. You imagine the scramble in the background, phones ringing, typewriters clacking, as someone decided the easiest way to control the narrative was simply to overwhelm it with a new one. You wander farther into the desert until the heat begins to shimmer like a thin veil, blurring the horizon. It feels fitting. The whole Roswell story has lived inside this haze for decades, a place where questions multiply faster than answers, and every attempt to clarify something creates two new uncertainties. You realize that confusion itself became a tool, a soft blanket tossed over the whole event, not to hide the truth perfectly, but to scatter it into so many tiny pieces that no one could assemble a full picture without tripping over contradictions. You find remnants of old newspaper clippings stored in a rusted box someone discarded years ago. Headlines scream possibility. Corrections whisper denial. Experts offer explanations in voices so confident they almost sound rehearsed. You try to line them up in order, only to discover they form a timeline as crooked as the horizon in front of you. The inconsistencies are not errors, they are patterns, a carefully muddled story that leaves you squinting at what seems obvious until the obvious dissolves a moment later. As the wind finally stirs, you hear the faint rustle of dry brush and imagine the countless people who tried to untangle this story before you. Amateur researchers with notebooks, skeptical journalists with restless curiosity, veterans who spoke softly about flashes in the night sky, and officials who delivered statements with smiles too crisp to trust. The more you think about it, the clearer it becomes that the confusion was never a flaw. It was the point. When certainty becomes too slippery to hold, most people eventually stop reaching for it. You turn to leave the desert, the sun lowering until the light softens into amber and every shadow stretches long and thin. You feel the zone of silence lingering behind you, waiting for the next visitor to wander into its puzzle. And as you walk back toward civilization, you carry with you a new understanding, one that settles quietly in your chest. Sometimes the easiest way to cover something up is not to hide it, but to make the truth so tangled, so contradictory, so muffled beneath shifting explanations that people choose confusion over clarity. You walk into a dim community hall that still smells faintly of old coffee and handmade protest signs, the kind of place where every bulletin board looks like it once held a dozen brilliant, impossible ideas. The walls echo with the memory of voices raised in passion rather than volume. People arguing about justice, equality, and the future in tones that somehow mixed hope with exhaustion. You can almost see them gathered around mismatched tables, debating strategy, drafting flyers, and passing around pens that always seem to run out of ink at the worst possible moment. It feels warm, earnest, human. Then you hear the whispers, quiet, cautious, threaded through the air like static, and you realize you have stepped into the part of the story no one wanted written down. A file sits on a folding chair in the corner, its edges curled as if it has been handled too many times. You open it and find reports written with unsettling detail, meetings described minute by minute, private arguments reduced to bullet points. Entire conversations typed out as though someone had been sitting inches away with unreal focus. You feel your shoulders tense as you flip through the pages, each one revealing another layer of surveillance woven directly into the fabric of movements built on trust. It becomes clear almost immediately that the FBI did not just observe activist groups, it joined them. You picture the agents at the time, walking into gatherings wearing thrift store jackets and earnest expressions, nodding along with slogans they did not believe. They shook hands enthusiastically, volunteered for committees, offered to staple flyers, and listened so attentively they must have seemed like the most dedicated members in the room. They blended in by being helpful, the fastest route to credibility. You imagine how difficult it must have been for real activists to distinguish sincerity from strategy when both wore the same tired smile. You read testimonies from people who later learned their trusted companions were not companions at all. They described the slow, creeping sense that something was off. A question asked too often, a suggestion that seemed designed to stir conflict. A person who appeared suddenly, contributed eagerly, and then vanished just as quickly once the operation moved on. You picture someone sitting in their kitchen late at night, replaying months of conversations, realizing that their biggest vulnerabilities were carefully written down in reports addressed to supervisors they never met. You find memos explaining tactics with an unnerving blend of confidence and creativity. Divide members with gossip, encourage radical proposals to discredit the group, create tension between leaders, suggest actions that draw legal trouble. You feel a chill reading each line, not because the strategies are loud or dramatic, but because they rely so heavily on understanding human nature. These were not brute force infiltrations. They were emotional ones, subtle enough that even the most perceptive people might miss the signs until it was too late. The 70s come alive around you as you flip through the pages. Protests erupting in city streets, music blaring from open windows, youth movements building momentum like storms gathering over a horizon. But now you see the other layer, the hidden chess game running beneath the surface. Groups failing because internal divisions seem to appear from nowhere. Leaders losing credibility due to rumors engineered 2 offices away from the truth. Plans collapsing not from weakness, but from pressure applied by hands that pretended not to exist. You picture the country during those years, stretched thin between generational upheaval, political scandal, cultural reinvention, and the invisible fingers rearranging activist landscapes. People woke up each morning wondering why unity felt so fragile, why movements fractured just as they gained momentum, why suspicion grew like a weed no one remembered planting. You understand now that the chaos was not accidental. It was cultivated. You linger over a final report, one describing an activist meeting in a quiet living room. The agent writes about the smell of the tea, the way one member laughed nervously, the moment another hesitated before speaking. Every detail preserved like an insect sealed in amber. You imagine the people in that room, unaware that their ordinary gestures were being recorded with more care than their hopes. You close the file gently, letting out a breath you did not realize you had been holding. The room feels heavier now, filled with the ghosts of movements that might have grown differently if trust had not been pried open again and again by invisible hands. As you leave the hall, you understand why the 70s felt chaotic. Not because people were reckless, but because they were trying to build something real while someone else quietly rearranged the floor beneath them. You stand on the deck of a ship that no longer exists, staring into waters that look calm enough to lull you into a false sense of wisdom. The air carries the scent of diesel and salt, a combination that feels almost honest compared to what you are about to witness. Sailors move with practiced urgency, their voices clipped and steady as they monitor the horizon. Somewhere in the control room, a radar screen glows with the quiet confidence of a machine that has no emotional investment in accuracy. You listen to the static, the hum, the metallic heartbeat of the destroyer, and you wait for the moment when uncertainty becomes something far louder. You are not really standing here, not in the literal sense, but history has a strange way of pulling you close enough that you can feel the tension vibrating beneath your feet. You sense the crew readying themselves for something they cannot quite define. A whisper of suspicion here, a nervous adjustment of headphones there. Everyone believes they know what should happen next, which is the first sign that nothing is about to make sense. The night around them folds into itself, warm and black, a perfect canvas for imagination to paint its most inconvenient shapes. Inside the radio room, you see operators leaning close to their equipment, straining to capture the smallest signals across the waves. A blip appears, faint and ambiguous, the sort of murmur that could mean danger or could mean a fish with strong opinions about naval hardware. Yet, in an atmosphere already thick with geopolitical tension, uncertainty feels like a luxury no one can afford. So the blip becomes a possibility. The possibility becomes a threat, and the threat begins to solidify even before anyone can truly identify it. The crew braces. Orders fly. The ocean, indifferent as always, keeps rolling. You watch the scene unfold with a strange mix of dread and curiosity. It is remarkable how quickly a single moment, drenched in confusion and adrenaline, can balloon into history. Someone sees a shadow and convinces himself it is a hostile vessel. Someone else hears a noise and decides it must be the first note of an attack. Human minds fill the silence with whatever story feels most urgent, and once the idea takes hold, the evidence shapes itself around it like a polite but misguided assistant. In the command center, the officers debate the significance of the signals. Voices rise, fall, clash, and blend into a single anxious rhythm. You can almost feel the heat of decision forming between them. The pressure to interpret the unknown correctly is immense, as if the entire weight of national pride is perched on a radar console that is silently pleading to be excluded from this narrative. Someone asks a question, someone answers too quickly, and suddenly the uncertainty becomes an incident. You feel the shift in the air when the first message is sent out. The tone is confident, the kind of confidence that comes from believing the universe aligns with your assumptions. Reports fly across cables and wires, carrying urgency toward desks far removed from the rocking deck of the destroyer. The whispers in Washington transform into declarations, each one more solid than the flickering signals that inspired them. You watch the transformation with a sinking feeling, like seeing a magician pull a rabbit out of a hat, even though you watched him put nothing inside. The narrative grows. Politicians step forward with stern expressions that imply certainty where none exists. Maps appear on desks, plans unfold, speeches begin to form in the minds of those who will soon deliver them. The disputed moment becomes a defining one. Sharp lines are drawn across oceans and continents because of signals that even the sailors later described with words like maybe, possibly, and not entirely sure. But in the machinery of government, ambiguity is often treated like an inconvenience rather than a warning. You picture the families back home, reading newspapers that speak with absolute clarity. No hint of hesitation, no faint outline of doubt, just bold, unwavering statements about what happened far away on waters they will never see. You feel the heavy tilt of the world as decisions stack on top of decisions, each one building momentum like a snowball rolling down a mountain, gathering speed and weight until stopping it becomes nearly impossible. As the chapter closes, you imagine yourself standing again on that ship, watching the ocean swallow every trace of the moment. The water looks calm, innocent even, as though it had nothing to do with the frenzy that followed. You begin to understand how a single, disputed event, born from static and nerves on a warm night, could ignite a conflict that reshaped lives for generations. And you realize that history often pivots not on certainty, but on the confidence with which uncertainty is declared. You walk into a narrow archive room stacked with binders that look too plain to hold anything extraordinary. The overhead lights flicker, casting long, uneven shadows across the shelves, as if the building itself is nervous about what you are about to uncover. You select a folder at random, expecting the usual bureaucratic dryness. But the first sentence makes you pause. It mentions an incident at a testing site described only as contained, a word that radiates far more confidence on paper than it ever does in reality. You feel the faint prickle of unease along your arms, the kind that arrives when you realize the officials writing these reports were more interested in controlling panic than telling the full truth. You move deeper into the files, flipping pages that grow stranger with each turn. One report details a reactor malfunction with the tone of someone describing a minor inconvenience, as though a nuclear core behaving unpredictably was no worse than a stubborn photocopier. You imagine the engineers on site, standing in a control room filled with humming machines and blinking lights, trading glances that say this is fine even though none of them believes it. Somewhere an alarm probably chirped half-heartedly, overwhelmed by the sheer determination of the staff to pretend everything was manageable. You find references to ponds glowing faintly at dusk, water reflecting hues that no natural body of liquid should ever consider wearing. The descriptions are so casual that you have to reread them to make sure they are not jokes. You picture a team of specialists standing at the edge of a shimmering pool, squinting at colors that hint at chemical mischief, and deciding the best course of action is to put up a flimsy fence and write a vague memo. The photograph attached shows a calm surface disturbed only by ripples. It looks peaceful in the way a sleeping dragon looks peaceful before someone makes the mistake of poking it. You flip to another section, tracing a timeline of events that were never meant to reach daylight. A technician misreads a gauge, a valve sticks, pressure rises, and somewhere an official decides the public would sleep better if they never heard about it. You sense the growing disconnect between what happened and what was reported, the gap widening into a chasm large enough to swallow entire truths. The reports pile up with the same refrain: under control, limited impact, no cause for concern. You picture the people writing these lines sitting at polished desks, far from the heat of the reactors, convincing themselves that carefully chosen words could contain radioactive reality. You read testimonies from workers who described bright flashes in the night sky, the kind that pulse just once but leave a memory etched behind your eyelids. They talk about strange, metallic tastes in the air, headaches spreading through crews like a silent rumor, animals behaving oddly near restricted zones. Their accounts feel raw, unpolished, almost too honest, which is why they appear only in the appendices, tucked away where casual readers would never bother to look. Another document tells the story of a monitoring device that recorded rising levels for days before anyone paid attention. The explanation offered is mechanical failure. You stare at the phrase, sensing that it was probably used the way someone uses the word coincidence when they prefer not to think harder about something uncomfortable. You imagine a technician standing alone in a bunker, staring at the readings, wondering whether the device is broken or whether the situation outside is about to become the kind of memory no one wants to pass down. You step back from the files and let the weight of everything settle over you. You begin to understand how secrecy grows around nuclear accidents, not always out of malice, but often from fear. Fear of public panic, fear of political fallout, fear of admitting that control is sometimes an illusion wrapped in scientific terminology. Yet the silence itself becomes a kind of danger. The truth does not disappear just because someone locks it inside a cabinet with a stern label. As you leave the archive room, you catch sight of an old photograph hanging crooked on the wall. It shows a quiet pond glimmering softly beneath a sunset. The colors look wrong now that you know what might cause such a glow. You take one last look, then turn away with a new instinct, settling firmly inside you. From now on, any photograph featuring water that sparkles a little too enthusiastically will earn your immediate and unwavering distrust. You ease open a metal drawer that squeals in protest, as though it has spent decades guarding its contents and now resents your curiosity. Inside, you find stacks of punch cards, brittle and yellowed, each one peppered with precise little holes like the world's least festive confetti. They look harmless at first, almost charming, the kind of relic you might find in a museum gift shop next to a collection of vacuum tube keychains. But as you lift one carefully between your fingers, you sense something else hidden beneath its quaint exterior. It feels like the earliest heartbeat of a surveillance system, still trying to figure out how to crawl. You step deeper into a room filled with humming machines, each one large enough to require its own gravitational field. They whir and click with mechanical certainty, swallowing punch cards through metal mouths that chew information far too greedily. The walls seem to vibrate with the rhythm of calculation, as though the building itself is listening. You picture early data analysts in crisp white shirts, feeding cards into these machines and feeling a thrill at how quickly they could process details about thousands of people. You imagine them standing proudly beside their equipment, unaware that they are helping build the foundation of something far more sprawling than any of them could fully grasp. You flip through forms designed to look innocuous, census sheets, employment documents, registration cards. Each line asks just a bit more than seems necessary, small boxes that invite answers with a casual tone that almost hides the intent behind them. You start to notice patterns in the questions, the quiet precision of how information was gathered, categorized, and stored. Names, addresses, occupations, family details, affiliations, a complete sketch of a person's life, all captured through slips of paper and machines that blink like they are trying to understand human beings by eating tiny rectangular snacks. You find a memo tucked between stacks of reports, written in the polite confidence of someone who believes they have made a brilliant discovery. It explains how punch card systems could help keep track of various populations, not in a sinister way, the memo insists, but in an efficient one. You picture the author leaning back in his office chair, pleased with himself, unaware that he is describing the earliest blueprint of a future digital net that will one day span the entire world. You sense the same tone you would hear from someone bragging about a pet goldfish, not realizing they accidentally adopted a shark. You examine a machine in the corner, its metal casing scratched from years of use. The label on its front reads like a promise of innovation, yet the more you study it, the more you feel it buzzing with the faint spirit of surveillance. You imagine the technicians who once stood here, sorting cards into neat piles, building profiles of people without ever meeting them. The process feels methodical, detached, strangely clinical. The machine does not question motives or morality. It simply records, sorts, and remembers. As you move through the room, the hum of machinery begins to blend with memories you never lived. You see government offices where punch cards were collected with growing enthusiasm, each new batch offering a clearer portrait of communities, patterns, and behaviors. Officials speak about efficiency and modernization, words that float easily through the air until you realize their practical meaning. When everything is collected, everything can be followed. And when everything can be followed, everything can be mapped. You flip to a file marked confidential. The ink faded, but still stern. It describes experiments in linking data sets together, combining punch cards from one agency with cards from another to create larger, more detailed profiles. You feel a ripple of recognition as you read, a sensation like stumbling upon a baby photo of the modern internet and seeing its familiar eyes staring back. The attempts are primitive, clunky, and slow, but undeniably present. It is the first spark of a future where information will become a currency powerful enough to predict decisions before they are even made. You picture a future engineer walking into this same room decades later, laughing softly at the ancient technology. Yet beneath the laughter, she would recognize something important. The intent behind the machines, the desire to gather, organize, and monitor. The quiet ambition to understand citizens not through conversation or connection, but through data points that never stop multiplying. You close the drawer gently, letting the punch cards rest again in their quiet archive. As you step away, the echoes of the machines linger in your mind. You see early data systems not as relics, but as the first footprints of a path that leads straight to the glowing screens and endless databases you navigate every day. And suddenly, those quaint little punch cards do not look harmless at all. They look like the first whisper of a digital world watching you before you even learn to watch it back. You step into a glass-walled office that prides itself on being modern, streamlined, and welcoming, yet somehow feels more like a terrarium where the plants have been replaced by people typing at desks. The air smells faintly of disinfectant and ambition, that familiar corporate blend that suggests productivity is measured not in hours but in heartbeats. At first glance, everything seems normal. Polite smiles, soft chatter, bad coffee attempting to pass as good coffee. But as you wander deeper, something begins to shift. A subtle prickle at the back of your neck that tells you the walls are listening a little too closely. You pause near a lobby plant that looks suspiciously healthier than any plant should be in a building with this little natural light. It sits beneath a tiny dome-shaped device, blinking with slow, steady confidence. You tilt your head, trying to convince yourself it is part of the sprinkler system, but the blinking suggests otherwise. You move on, reminding yourself that modern offices use all sorts of harmless technology, sensors for climate control, sensors for energy efficiency, sensors for things no one bothers to ask about because the explanations sound authoritative enough to end the conversation. As you step into an open workspace, you notice that every keyboard seems unusually quiet, as if the keys have learned not to draw attention to themselves. A soft ping echoes from a screen, followed by a pop-up asking an employee to complete a quick wellness reflection. You watch her sigh, click obediently, and type something vague about feeling focused. She looks focused enough, though the way she glances at the corners of her monitor suggests she is aware she is not typing for herself alone. You walk past a conference room where a meeting is underway. The walls are glass, the smiles look rehearsed, and a device on the table listens with a posture more attentive than any of the humans. It lights up each time someone speaks, recording tone, cadence, maybe even the emotional arc of their day. The team leans forward, nodding as if the device is just a tool, nothing more. But you sense its presence, shaping the conversation, guiding people toward safer phrases, softer opinions, gentler disagreements. Farther down the hall, you find an office labeled analytics, a word that once meant curiosity but now seems to mean cataloging the hidden pulses of human behavior. Inside, a small team studies dashboards filled with moving charts. They murmur to one another about engagement levels, productivity curves, and something called behavioral indicators. You watch in disbelief as one analyst zooms into a graph, charting break patterns, the line rising and falling like the pulse of someone being monitored far too closely. The analyst nods approvingly, as though the system is simply reflecting the natural order of things. You step away, your shoes sinking slightly into carpet that muffles every sound except the drumming of your thoughts. It hits you gradually, the realization that corporate surveillance did not sneak in through back doors or cloak itself in mystery. It arrived with sleek branding and cheerful emails, presenting itself not as a watchful presence, but as an improvement, a convenience, a helpful assistant tracking your workflow, your efficiency, your well-being. You realize the cleverness of it. When something presents itself as helpful, people rarely question its gaze. You wander into the break room, hoping for a moment of normalcy. But even here, a small camera rests discreetly in the corner, angled toward the table where employees chat over instant coffee. A motion sensor clicks softly when you step inside. The fridge has a digital lock that logs each opening, allegedly for temperature tracking. You picture a hypothetical report analyzing snack habits and wonder when something meant to preserve food quietly evolved into something that records you grabbing yogurt at lunchtime. The strangest conspiracies, you realize, are not hidden in dusty basements or secret bunkers. They sit right here in brightly lit offices, humming with approval, offering improvements you never asked for. They do not whisper. They chirp politely through app notifications. They do not disguise themselves. They arrive in sleek packaging with cheerful icons. And unlike the shadowy operations of the past, these systems do not need secrecy. They simply need convenience. You leave the building and step into the daylight, carrying with you the uneasy understanding that the modern world watches without pretending otherwise. Corporate surveillance wears a friendly smile, speaks in colorful infographics, and greets you each morning with personalized suggestions. And as you walk away, you cannot help glancing at your phone, suddenly aware that it, too, is listening, blinking gently from your pocket like a loyal pet that reports everything it sees. You step into a dimly lit research facility that feels like it was built specifically to keep sunlight out. The walls are lined with metal cabinets stamped with cryptic codes, and the fluorescent bulbs overhead flicker in a rhythm that makes you wonder whether they are malfunctioning or communicating. The Cold War hums beneath every surface, vibrating faintly like a distant engine that never shuts off. You walk deeper, past a desk scattered with reel-to-reel tapes and folders stacked so high they might collapse if you breathe too hard. Each folder bears a title that sounds like someone combined military jargon with a psychology textbook in a moment of questionable creativity. You open the first folder and discover pages describing experiments that seem to straddle the line between scientific inquiry and creative paranoia. The tone is clinical, but the content reads like the plot of a spy novel written by someone who did not trust their own shadow. Psychological warfare, the papers declare, needs to go beyond leaflets and broadcasts. It must reach into the mind itself, slipping through the cracks of perception, nudging thoughts in directions the target will never notice. You sit back for a moment, imagining a room full of officials nodding solemnly as someone pitches the idea of influencing emotions like a puppeteer adjusting strings. You find diagrams of sound waves, carefully labeled to show which frequencies supposedly unsettle the human mind. Engineers experimented with low tones that hum just below conscious awareness, vibrations meant to induce discomfort or anxiety. You picture a technician standing in a bunker, adjusting knobs while a group of volunteers fidget uneasily, unable to explain why their skin prickles and their hearts race. Another document describes visual illusions designed to induce disorientation, images flickering at speeds that bypass rational thought. You sense the eerie enthusiasm of researchers who believed they were on the brink of discovering the psychological master key to human behavior. As you move through the files, you encounter accounts of field tests carried out in places so remote that the reports might as well describe haunted landscapes. Troops stationed near loudspeakers, broadcasting carefully crafted messages, each one structured to unnerve enemy forces by combining cultural symbols with unsettling rhythms. You can almost hear the recordings echoing across fog-covered hills, the kind of sound that makes animals bolt and people look over their shoulders without knowing why. There are notes praising the effectiveness of confusion, insisting that uncertainty is sometimes more powerful than firepower. You flip through pages describing experiments with misinformation, stories planted carefully to sow doubt within enemy ranks. The reports detail how rumors were shaped, released, and monitored, as though human belief could be managed like a chemical reaction. You imagine intelligence officers sitting in smoky rooms, debating the best phrasing for a whisper that would ripple through enemy territory and sprout into fear. Their confidence is unsettling, the certainty with which they describe manipulating entire populations through targeted psychological nudges. Then, you uncover the more unsettling techniques, the ones that make you shift uncomfortably in your chair. Training programs designed to teach operatives how to dismantle a person's sense of reality. Scripts crafted to isolate a target emotionally, pushing them toward decisions they would never make under normal circumstances. Manuals for destabilizing trust within small groups, encouraging internal fractures until alliances crumble. You feel a cold ripple as you read these pages. The recognition that psychological warfare did not always aim outward. Sometimes it turned inward, testing its tools on people far too close to home. You step away from the cabinet and walk down a hallway filled with outdated technology. Tape recorders hum faintly. A projector clicks in the corner, looping an image that has long since lost its meaning. You realize that the architects of these programs believed they were defending their nation, but somewhere along the way, they began treating the human mind like a battlefield, a place where tactics could be tested and refined. The line between defense and intrusion blurred until no one could clearly point to where it had once been drawn. You find one last folder near the exit, thinner than the others. It contains a summary written years after the programs faded, a reflection by someone who clearly wrestled with their own role. The language is quieter, almost remorseful, admitting that some methods went too far, that some experiments asked questions no one should ever try to answer. The author writes that psychological warfare often succeeds not through brilliance, but through exploiting vulnerabilities that exist in everyone. Reading it, you feel a faint tightening in your chest. You leave the facility slowly, every sound behind you suddenly sharper than before. The breeze brushing your arm feels like a whisper. The creak of a distant door seems deliberate. You tell yourself it is nothing, just old buildings settling, just shadows doing what shadows do. But as you step outside and the night folds around you, you find yourself glancing over your shoulder more often than usual, aware that once you have seen how the mind can be used as a battleground, sleep does not come quite as easily. You walk into an old laboratory that smells faintly of warm circuitry, dust, and the kind of optimism that comes only from people convinced they are building something useful, not something that will eventually consume every spare minute of human attention. The lights hum softly overhead, casting long reflections across rows of terminals that look bulky and awkward, like early prototypes of creatures that have not yet learned how to walk elegantly. You run your hand along a metal console, feeling the faint vibrations of life inside it, and realize you are standing at the threshold of a world that did not exist yet, but was already beginning to imagine itself. You open a binder resting on a metal stool. The pages describe packet switching in language so calm and academic it hides how revolutionary it truly was. The diagrams look simple, almost playful, lines connecting to other lines, small boxes representing nodes that will one day resemble cities connected by light. You can almost hear the researchers explaining their ideas in excited voices, unaware that those excited voices will echo for decades across a digital expanse they could barely conceptualize. The reports speak of resilience, of networks that remain alive even when pieces fall away. You picture engineers nodding along, sipping coffee so terrible it probably qualified as chemical warfare, fully unaware that the world was about to reorganize itself around these very ideas. You step into another room where a small team once hammered out the early architecture of a connected future. The tables are cluttered with soldering irons, spools of wire, and notebooks filled with equations that seem to hum with potential energy. You imagine someone trying to explain the concept to an outsider, describing a system where information could hop from machine to machine like a message passed through a chain of very obedient relay runners. At the time, it must have sounded more like science fiction than strategy, yet the urgency behind the project pulses in every scribbled note. The Cold War casts its long, icy shadow across the room, shaping every decision. The researchers wanted a communication system that could survive almost anything, a network without a single point of failure, one that could reroute messages automatically. You imagine them pacing the floor, arguing passionately about redundancy, topology, and the nature of information itself, all while the future leaned in and listened like a child perched on the edge of a storybook. You find a set of printouts showing the first messages ever sent across the early network. They are short, clumsy, and anticlimactic, the digital equivalent of stammering out a greeting during an awkward first date. But beneath their awkwardness lies something extraordinary. It is the moment the world took its first breath in binary. The moment information learned it could travel farther and faster than any previous technology allowed. You stare at the printouts and feel the weight of that moment, the way tiny steps often shape massive destinies. Walking farther, you discover a whiteboard covered in marker stains that no amount of scrubbing could erase. Words like protocol and interface stand out among doodles of interconnected nodes. You picture the researchers leaning over the board, arguing about details so minute they likely felt microscopic at the time. Yet every small decision, every argument about standards and compatibility became a brick in a road that would lead to global connectivity. They were constructing not just a network, but an ecosystem. You pause as you enter the final room. It is darker here, quieter, as though the past itself understands the significance of what you are about to witness. A large terminal sits at the center, humming faintly, a relic of the moment when everything changed. You approach it slowly, feeling the air vibrate with a pulse that is both old and timeless. The machine seems almost alive, as if it remembers the first time electrical signals traveled through its circuits and realized they were part of something larger than themselves. You place your hand on the console and feel a subtle tremor beneath your palm, like the echo of a heartbeat that still reverberates across the modern world. You imagine the researchers standing here decades ago, unaware that their creation would grow into an omnipresent force that shapes relationships, decisions, and identities. They were building a tool. They did not realize they were waking a future. As you leave the laboratory, the hum follows you into the hall, low and steady. You realize it is not just the sound of machines. It is the sound of the world that will eventually rise from these rooms, humming with connection, possibility, and a digital pulse that never sleeps. You find yourself standing in the middle of a silent hangar, lit by a few trembling bulbs that cast long shadows across the concrete floor. The air smells faintly of engine oil and cold metal, the kind of scent that carries the memory of machines designed to stay hidden. At first glance, the place seems deserted, nothing more than an oversized garage filled with forgotten equipment. But as your eyes adjust, you see the sleek outline of an aircraft tucked beneath a tarp, its angles too sharp and purposeful to belong to anything ordinary. You step closer and feel the echo of secrets humming beneath the fabric. You grip the edge of the tarp and lift it slowly. The aircraft beneath looks like something that escaped from a sketchbook in the back pocket of an engineer who got bored during a meeting. Its shape is strange, elegant, almost alive, as though someone asked a bird to dream up what flight could become. Every surface seems designed to glide through the sky without leaving a whisper. You can almost imagine how it must have looked soaring above deserts and coastlines, a dark silhouette, invisible to anyone who did not know where to look. You flip through a folder resting on a nearby table, its pages filled with photographs taken from impossible heights. The images are crisp, detailed, and unsettlingly intimate. Entire landscapes captured from a vantage point no civilian would have imagined possible at the time. You trace the outlines of distant mountains, cities, roads curling like quiet threads across the earth. Some photos show only blank stretches of ocean. Sprinkled with small white flecks, the reports insist are boats. Others capture facilities that officials swore did not exist, each one framed with the camera's calm, unblinking eye. You read about pilots who trained in the dead of night, flying aircraft the government refused to acknowledge. They learned to move silently through the sky, trusting only their instruments and the faint glow of stars above them. You picture them climbing into cockpits with steady determination, aware that even their families could not know the truth about their missions. Their job was not only to gather information but to remain unseen, leaving behind trails of mystery that civilians would later describe as strange lights drifting across the sky. You walk outside onto a small airstrip where the wind moves freely across the open space. You imagine an aircraft lifting off from this very spot decades ago, rising into the darkness with a quiet rush that would blend effortlessly into the night. People miles away might have looked up and seen something glimmer faintly, a streak of silver moving at an impossible speed. They would whisper about extraterrestrial visitors or cosmic signs, never realizing the truth was far more terrestrial and far more classified. You flip another page in the folder and find a section dedicated to public sightings. Reports flood in from rural towns, desert highways, and quiet suburbs. People describe hovering discs, glowing shapes, lights that darted across the sky in ways no commercial plane ever could. You feel a pinch of sympathy as you read their accounts. They were not wrong to think something unusual was happening. They simply misidentified the source. Few could have imagined that the sky itself had become a laboratory for new aircraft, each one a silent witness to a future still being stitched together. As you continue reading, you see descriptions of test flights that pushed the limits of aerodynamics, engines that ran hotter than anything built before, wings shaped to slip through radar as though radar were nothing more than a stubborn breeze. The programs operated under layers of secrecy so thick that even the people inside them often knew only fragments of the truth. You understand now how easily civilians misinterpreted the brilliant flashes produced when aircraft broke through atmospheric layers with speeds that defied expectation. You close the folder and stand for a moment in the open air, staring at the sky. It looks calm, familiar, innocent, but now you recognize how many stories unfolded above those clouds while entire communities stared upward in confusion. You imagine the countless times a pilot streaked across the horizon at dusk, leaving behind a shimmering trail that someone mistook for an otherworldly visitor. Maybe they snapped a photograph, maybe they told their neighbors, maybe they carried the mystery in their minds for years. You feel a slow shift in your perception as you walk back toward the hangar. The sky has always been full of secrets, but not all of them came from distant galaxies. Some were born in hidden workshops like this one, built by human hands and fueled by earthly ambition. And as you take one last glance at the dark silhouette beneath the tarp, you begin to wonder how many strange lights in old stories were not extraterrestrial at all, but simply the quiet flutter of classified wings cutting through the night. You stand at the edge of a forest that looks peaceful in the way a painting looks peaceful, all soft sunlight and gently swaying branches. But as you walk deeper, the air changes. It grows heavier, almost metallic, like the earth is holding its breath. You follow a narrow path until you reach a clearing where the ground darkens in a way that does not feel natural. A small pond sits still and silent, yet something about its surface seems too smooth, too perfect, like a mirror trying too hard. You crouch down, half expecting to see your reflection staring back with a warning you cannot quite hear. Then you open the first file in your hands, a government report with that familiar tone of tight-lipped optimism. It insists everything is fine, that the anomalies are minor, that any unusual readings fall well within acceptable ranges. You read this with the same skepticism you reserve for weather forecasts that promise sunshine while thunder rumbles directly overhead. The numbers look neat, almost suspiciously polite, like someone straightened their tie before typing them. Yet the photos clipped to the back tell another story entirely. Plants warped into shapes no garden would ever tolerate. Soil that clumps strangely, as though it has been scorched and rewoven. Streams, carrying colors, that have no business being in water unless a rainbow melted underwater. You flip to another report and find notes about containment, though the definition of that word appears to shift conveniently depending on the writer. One memo claims a leak was isolated, another insists the leak never happened. A third describes a cleanup crew dispatched to address the leak that apparently did not exist. You picture officials sitting around a long table, shuffling papers, debating which version of the truth sounds the least alarming. They probably chose the one that required the fewest syllables, hoping brevity would double as reassurance. You walk alongside a chain-link fence, enclosing a stretch of land that looks like it has been left to fend for itself. The grass grows unevenly, patches of it burned into brittle straw beside areas that look too lush, too eager. You can feel the contradiction in the air, a tug of war between decay and overgrowth. It is the kind of landscape that whispers warnings even when silent. You imagine workers decades ago stepping through this same area wearing protective suits that reflected the sun in harsh glints. They carried equipment that hummed ominously, their movements deliberate, though their reports later described the job as routine maintenance. You examine documents detailing industrial runoff, finding its way into rivers disguised as harmless byproducts. The wording is carefully crafted, full of technical terms designed to lull readers into a sense of detached confidence. But you picture the runoff pouring through pipes, drifting into streams, slipping past rocks like liquid strangers. You picture fish swimming lazily until their instincts twist into disorientation, their patterns fractured by something they cannot escape. Entire ecosystems shifting underfoot. Yet the reports summarize these changes in 3 polite sentences and a chart that claims the impact is localized. The deeper you go into the files, the more you encounter the same familiar dance. A spill described as manageable, a plume of chemicals marked minimal, a malfunction categorized as unlikely to recur. You imagine the people who wrote these phrases, staring at their keyboards late at night, deciding how to phrase disaster in a way that makes it sound like a scheduling inconvenience. Meanwhile, the land absorbed every lie, the soil keeping its own records in patterns of sickness and silence. You return to the clearing and notice how the pond's surface trembles even without wind. Beneath the still water, faint streaks of iridescent sheen drift like ghosts trying to rise. You suddenly understand why communities downriver felt uneasy long before the reports confirmed anything. Nature has never been good at lying. It shows its bruises openly, even when humans do everything possible to hide the hand that caused them. You set the last folder down on a fallen log and breathe in the heavy air. You can sense the truth beneath every page, seeping up through the carefully phrased reassurances. It leaks through the cracks of the official narrative, the same way water forces itself through fractured stone, slow at first, then unstoppable. And as you walk back toward the forest's edge, you feel a quiet certainty settle in your chest. Some disasters do not explode. They seep, they whisper, they stain. And no matter how many layers of language are piled on top of them, the truth still rises, persistent as groundwater. You sit in a quiet records room that feels like it has been waiting decades for someone to notice it exists. Dust hangs in the air like a slow-falling confession, drifting lazily across rows of boxes stamped with dates that span entire lifetimes. You open the first box, half expecting it to dissolve into cobwebs, but instead, you find an avalanche of documents stacked so tightly they seem to hold their breath. You pull out a folder, and as you flip it open, the sound is soft but sharp, like fabric tearing in the distance. It is the sound of secrecy beginning to crack. At first, the documents speak cautiously, full of formal language and carefully measured statements. You read reports that insist nothing extraordinary took place. that programs ended long before anyone had reason to question them, that mistakes were isolated and impacts limited. Each sentence feels rehearsed, the kind of polished denial that rolls off the page with suspicious ease. You imagine officials sitting in conference rooms drafting these responses, confident their wording will age better than the truth. But time has a way of growing impatient with lies, and the paper in your hands feels like the first tremor before the ground shifts. You walk down the aisle and open another box, then another, and soon the quiet room is filled with stacks of forgotten history. You begin to see the threads connecting them, faint at first, then unmistakable. A memo counters an earlier claim. A redacted paragraph hides something that another document reveals outright. A footnote challenges entire narratives. You watch contradictions accumulate until denial buckles under its own weight. Decades of silence unravel in slow motion, like a zipper finally giving way after being tugged too many times. You find testimonies tucked into binders, written by people who carried their secrets long after they clocked out of their jobs. Some write with guilt, others with resignation, a few with relief. Their words feel raw in comparison to the polished language of official reports. They speak of projects that spiraled beyond intention, experiments that raised more questions than solutions, decisions made in panic rather than wisdom. Reading them feels like listening to someone finally exhale after holding their breath for half a century. You imagine the world outside these walls during those decades, people living their lives unaware of the quiet machinery working behind the scenes. Every so often rumors surfaced, scattered like sparks, but officials stamped them out with professional confidence. When witnesses came forward, they were dismissed. When reporters asked questions, they were given labyrinths instead of answers. You picture citizens sitting at kitchen tables reading sanitized statements in newspapers, trusting them because trust was simpler than suspicion. Then, somewhere along the line, a leak appears. A retired official speaks too candidly. A journalist stumbles onto something that refuses to stay buried. A document meant to be shredded instead lands in the wrong pile. The unraveling begins slowly, subtly, as though secrecy itself is growing tired. Once the threads loosen, momentum builds. You see hearings aired on television, news anchors narrowing their eyes as they read updates, citizens leaning closer to their screens as old stories split open and spill into daylight. You flip another document and feel the shift in tone. Now the reports sound apologetic, even contrite. They acknowledge what was denied, clarify what was concealed, and promise transparency with the enthusiasm of someone late to their own apology. The language grows louder, more assertive, as if hoping the force of confession might soften the years of silence that preceded it. You picture officials speaking in press conferences with brisk sincerity, trying to catch up to a truth that sprinted ahead of them long ago. You stack the documents carefully, feeling the weight of how much had been hidden and how suddenly everything changed once the veil tore. It is not the gentle unveiling you imagined. When transparency finally arrives, it does not creep or tiptoe. It bursts in like an overdue guest, pushing open a door too quickly, scattering apologies, explanations, and revisions across the floor. You realize that secrecy ages poorly, becoming brittle and fragile until the smallest nudge sends it collapsing. As you leave the records room, the door swings shut behind you with a soft echo. The hallway outside feels brighter than before, the air lighter, as though truth has been oxygen waiting to be released. You walk forward with a strange mix of satisfaction and unease. Transparency always arrives late, but when it finally comes, it does not whisper. It announces itself. You sit with the final folder resting on your knees, its edges softened by time, its weight far heavier than the thin cardboard suggests. The room around you feels quieter now, as if even the dust has paused to listen. You flip through the last few pages slowly, aware that you have walked through decades of hidden rooms, locked drawers, and secrets disguised as routine memos. Each chapter of this journey has taken you deeper into the strange spaces between official statements and lived reality, places where the truth never quite matched the story printed in the headlines. Now, As you reach the end, the threads settle into a shape you did not expect. You glance at the first documents you collected, recalling how neatly they tried to explain the inexplicable. They spoke with the calm certainty of people who believed the past could be tidied if they chose polite enough words. But the deeper you traveled, the more the neatness frayed. You saw how government experiments wandered into unsettling territory, how programs born from fear grew into monsters their creators pretended not to see, how secrecy became less a practice and more a reflex. And somewhere along the way, you realize that conspiracy theories never truly capture the strange mess of what actually happened. They are too clean, too heroic, too dramatic. Reality stumbles. It contradicts itself. It forgets its own lines. You remember the handwritten notes from technicians who tried to summarize the consequences of their work while admitting, in the quiet slant of their letters, that even they did not fully understand what they had set in motion. You think of the aerial reconnaissance programs that sent unacknowledged aircraft across the night sky, leaving behind trails mistaken for extraterrestrial visitors. The truth was less mystical, yet somehow more astonishing. Engineers pushing materials to their limits, pilots trusting machines that seemed to hum with a will of their own, entire teams working in shadows so deep that the people right below them never knew they were there. You recall the secret psychological projects that treated the human mind like a puzzle box waiting to be picked open. The reports insisted on progress, yet the testimonies whispered unease. You could almost feel the tension in those rooms, the sense that something was being pressed too far. The truth was not a single dramatic breakthrough, but a series of jarring near misses, each one leaving behind strange debris in the form of rumors and fragmented memories. Then your thoughts drift to the environmental disasters, carefully folded between layers of official language. Streams glowing faintly beneath dusk, soil clinging to a chemical tang, forests that grew in patterns nature never intended. The theories about cover-ups always imagined a deliberate hand guiding everything. But the reality looked more like a frantic juggling act, where officials scrambled to shape a narrative faster than the truth could seep through the cracks. It was messier, sadder, and strangely human. You turn the last page and feel the weight of it settle in your chest. Not heaviness exactly, but a kind of solemn recognition. The conspiracies that turned out to be true were never elegant. They were awkward, disjointed, shaped by fear, ego, urgency, and the quiet hope that no one would ask too many questions. The theories painted everything with smooth edges and clear villains. The truth, however, came wrapped in contradictions. Some people were misguided. Some were frightened. Some convinced themselves they were doing the right thing while never checking their own shadows. You close the folder and listen to the soft click as it shuts, a sound that marks the end of a long and wandering path. Sitting there in the dim light, you realize something simple yet profound. The past is always stranger than you expect, because it was lived by ordinary people making choices under extraordinary pressure. It is messier than any theory can capture, because reality never bothers to stay consistent. It is more honest, too, in a crooked and reluctant way, because the truth eventually leaks through even when no one invites it. You run your hand across the cover one last time and place it back on the shelf. The room feels lighter now, as though the stories have finally exhaled. As you walk away, you understand that the strangest conspiracies were never myths to unravel, but reminders of how complicated, flawed, and unexpectedly human history really is,